Go ahead and get comfortable. Settle in wherever you are, close your eyes if you want, and let this wash over you, because tonight we are going to spend a long, slow, unhurried evening inside one of the strangest fictional places that has ever existed. A town called Springfield. You already know this town. Even if you have not watched a single episode in 20 years, you know it. You know the yellow skin of its residents. You know the nuclear cooling towers that loom on the horizon like a pair of silent sentinels. You know the couch, the television, the sound of a man hitting the floor after sliding down from a dinosaur. Springfield has been inside your cultural memory for so long that it stopped feeling like a show a long time ago and started feeling like a place you actually visited once, in some half-remembered version of your childhood that you can never quite pin down. That familiarity is exactly what makes it so strange when you start looking closely. Because Springfield should not work. None of it should work. The geography is impossible. The biology is impossible. The economics, the social structure, the legal system, the timeline, all of it, when examined with any care at all, dissolves into a fog of contradictions so dense and so deliberate that you start to wonder whether the people who created it were making mistakes or leaving messages. Tonight we are going to move slowly through Springfield's deepest mysteries. We are going to look at the theories that fans have spent decades building, the questions the show has never answered, and the evidence that has been sitting in plain sight since the very first season. And we are going to do it in the most comfortable way possible, quietly, without urgency, the way you would explore a strange old house with a flashlight at night when there is nowhere you need to be. So let's start with the thing that, once you notice it, you genuinely cannot unnotice. Nobody in Springfield has aged a single day. That sentence sounds simple. It sounds like something you already knew, something you filed away under, "It's a cartoon, that's just how cartoons work" a long time ago. But sit with it for a moment, because the implications of that sentence are far stranger than they appear on the surface. The Simpsons first aired on the 17th of December, 1989. On that night, Bart Simpson was 10 years old. He had a skateboard, a slingshot, and a particular talent for chaos that had already made him something close to a cultural icon before the show was even 3 months old. That was 1989, more than 3.5 decades ago, and Bart Simpson is still 10 years old right now. Lisa was 8 then, she is 8 now. Maggie was an infant then, she is an infant now. Homer and Marge were somewhere in their mid-30s, a working-class couple from a medium-sized American city, and they are still somewhere in their mid-30s, still in that same house, still with those same children who have not grown a single inch or gained a single year. More than 36 years have passed in the world outside the television. Inside Springfield, the calendar has never moved. Now, the standard explanation for this is what the television industry calls a floating timeline. The idea is simple enough. The show's present is always the viewer's present. When an episode airs in 2025, the characters are living in 2025. When an episode aired in 1994, the characters were living in 1994. The technology around them changes. The cultural references update. The jokes are pulled from whatever is happening in the world at the moment the episode is written. But the characters themselves remain fixed, anchored to the ages they were when the show began, living forever in a kind of permanent present tense that never advances forward. Every long-running animated show does some version of this. The Flintstones, Scooby-Doo, SpongeBob SquarePants, none of these characters age in any meaningful way. It is considered a standard feature of the format, and most audiences accept it without a second thought. But The Simpsons has been running long enough that the floating timeline has stopped being a comfortable convention and started being a genuine philosophical puzzle. Here is why. In 1989, when Homer and Marge were established as mid-30s parents, their backstory was anchored to the 1970s. They had grown up in the 70s. They had gone to high school in the 70s. Their courtship, their early relationship, the whole emotional history of their marriage was set against the backdrop of that particular decade, the music, the fashion, the cultural anxiety of an era that the audience of 1989 would have recognized as recent history. It made sense. A 35-year-old in 1989 would have been a teenager in the early 70s. The math worked. But the math no longer works. If Homer and Marge are still in their mid-30s in 2025, they did not grow up in the 1970s. They were not teenagers in the era of Watergate and disco and AM radio. They were teenagers in the early 2000s. Their high school years would have been defined by the early internet, by flip phones and MySpace, and a world that looks almost nothing like the one the show originally placed them in. The show has acknowledged this problem repeatedly, though never directly. It has quietly updated the backstory. Flashback episodes that once placed Homer and Marge's youth firmly in the 70s have been replaced by flashback episodes that place it in the 80s, then the 90s, then somewhere in the vague early aughts. The specific era keeps sliding forward like a piece of furniture being pushed across a floor, staying just behind the characters' current ages without ever fully resolving into something consistent. Homer and Marge have been teenagers in at least 4 different decades, depending on which episode you happen to be watching. Their origin story has been told and retold so many times, with so many different cultural details, that it has stopped being a history and started being a feeling. The feeling of 2 young people falling in love, stripped of any specific era, free-floating in a past that reshapes itself to fit whatever the current episode requires. And this is where the mystery starts to deepen. Because a floating timeline is not just a production convenience, it is a choice. And the choice to keep The Simpsons frozen at exactly these ages, at exactly this stage of their lives, with these exact family dynamics locked in permanent suspension, that choice was not made thoughtlessly. It was made deliberately, and it has been maintained deliberately for longer than many of the show's current viewers have been alive. Think about what the show would look like if the timeline had been allowed to move normally. Bart would be in his late 40s right now. He would be older than Homer was when the show began. He would potentially have children of his own, or maybe no children, or maybe a life that went in a direction nobody expected. He would be a middle-aged man carrying 36 years of lived experience, and whatever he had become, whether that was something wonderful or something deeply sad or something gloriously chaotic, he would be unrecognizable as the 10-year-old kid with the slingshot that the audience fell in love with. Lisa would be in her mid-40s. She would have finished college, finished graduate school, had a career and a life, and whatever private heartbreaks and victories a woman of her particular intelligence and sensitivity would accumulate over the decades. She might have changed the world in the way she always wanted to, or she might have been ground down by it, the way idealists often are. She would not be 8 years old with a saxophone and an unwavering certainty that the world could be better. And Maggie Simpson, still holding that same pacifier, still toddling around the edges of scenes with those enormous eyes taking in everything around her. Maggie would be in her 30s. She would have grown up in a world that never knew her as an infant, a world that had no idea she once shot a billionaire and organized a daycare rebellion and solved problems that confounded adults 3 times her age. She would just be a person with a past that nobody but her family remembered. The show has glimpsed these futures. Season 6's episode about Lisa's wedding showed her as a young adult, and the portrait was so specific and so emotionally true to the character that it felt genuinely moving. The show is capable of imagining these futures. It is fully capable of letting these characters grow up and become whoever they were always going to become. It just refuses to. And that refusal, that sustained, deliberate, decades-long choice to hold the pause button down and never let go, is one of the strangest creative decisions in the history of American television. Because it is not just a production choice. It is a statement. It is the show saying, quietly and consistently, and without ever acknowledging that it is saying anything at all, these people cannot be allowed to change. There are several theories about why, about what force, within the logic of Springfield itself, could be responsible for locking every single resident of this town in a state of permanent temporal suspension. And each of those theories leads somewhere different, reveals something different about what kind of place Springfield actually is. We will get to all of them tonight. But let's stay with the timeline for a little longer, because there is a detail buried inside it that most people overlook. It is not just that The Simpsons do not age, it is that Springfield as a whole does not age. The town has experienced events that should have permanently altered it, events so massive and so consequential that no real community could have absorbed them and simply moved on. It has been struck by a comet. It has been sealed under a dome by the federal government. It has experienced multiple near-nuclear catastrophes, a monorail disaster, an invasion by a foreign nation for exactly 1 episode, floods, fires, riots, and at least 1 occasion where the sun was literally blocked from the sky by a device operated by a single private citizen. After every one of these events, by the following episode, everything is back to normal. Not just sort of normal. Exactly normal. The comet is gone and the crater has been filled. The dome is lifted and never discussed again. The monorail is just a memory that occasionally gets referenced as a joke. The injuries are healed. The buildings are rebuilt. The catastrophes are absorbed and forgotten as if they happened to a different town in a different show. Fans have always called this episodic storytelling. The idea that each episode exists as its own closed unit, complete with its own conflict and resolution, with the understanding that no conflict or resolution carries forward into the next installment. It is a convention of television, particularly of animated television, and The Simpsons built its entire structure around it in its earliest seasons. But here is what becomes strange. No other element of the show has stayed as consistent as the reset. The humor has evolved. The tone has changed enormously over the decades. The show that aired in 1990 and the show that aired in 2020 share character names and setting details, but feel almost entirely different in terms of what they are trying to do and how they are trying to do it. Characters have been given backstories they did not have before. Relationships have shifted. New characters have been introduced and become as familiar as the originals. The one thing that has never changed, across every season and every tonal shift and every creative evolution, is the reset. Whatever happens in Springfield, the town forgets it. The slate wipes clean. The next episode begins with everything restored to the default setting. That is not laziness. Lazy storytelling forgets things accidentally. This is something more intentional, more architectural, a feature that has been built into the show's structure so completely that it has become invisible. You do not notice the reset when you are watching. You only notice it when you start thinking about the accumulation of everything that has been reset, laid out across 36 years in a list that goes on long enough to make you genuinely uncomfortable. Now, here is where the timeline mystery opens into something larger. If you take any single theory about Springfield, the radiation theory, the coma theory, the collective denial theory, and you apply it to the floating timeline, something interesting happens. Each theory arrives at the same conclusion through a completely different route. And that conclusion is this. The characters of The Simpsons are not just aging slowly or aging unusually. They are not aging at all, and that absence of aging is a symptom of something that has gone fundamentally wrong in Springfield. The radiation theory says that decades of nuclear exposure from the power plant have altered the cellular biology of every Springfield resident so completely that normal aging processes have been disrupted. The coma theory says that Homer Simpson has been unconscious since 1993, and everything that has happened since then has been a dream generated by his deteriorating brain, a dream that naturally preserves its subjects at the ages Homer last remembers them. The collective denial theory says that Springfield as a community has decided, through a kind of mass psychological agreement, to refuse to acknowledge the passage of time, in the same way it refuses to acknowledge the three-eyed fish and the cracked cooling towers, and the billionaire who remembers events from before most countries currently represented in the United Nations existed. 3 different explanations, 3 different mechanisms, all pointing at the same clock, the one on the wall in Springfield, that has shown the same time since 1989 and shows no sign of ever changing. The floating timeline. When you strip away the television industry jargon and look at it purely as a storytelling phenomenon, is one of the most extraordinary things that has ever happened in the history of American popular culture. A family has been preserved in amber for longer than the Cold War lasted. Their children have not grown, their house has not changed. Their neighborhood, their town, their entire world has remained essentially identical across more than 3 decades of real-world change that has been seismic in almost every conceivable dimension. The internet has transformed society in ways that nobody in 1989 could have predicted. The political landscape has shifted beyond recognition. Technologies that seemed like science fiction in the show's first season are now household objects. The entire context in which Springfield exists has been remade from the ground up multiple times, and yet Springfield itself persists the same yellow-skinned, 4-fingered, 3-eyed fish-tolerating community it has always been. There is a particular emotional texture to this, if you let yourself feel it. The Simpsons arrived in 1989 and immediately became the show that millions of families watched together. Children who were Bart's age in 1989 grew up watching this show. They went through adolescence with it, went to college with it, got married, and had children of their own with it running in the background of their lives. Those children of theirs are now adults. The grandchildren of the original audience are now watching episodes that aired before their parents were born. And through all of that, all those decades of real human life, all that genuine aging and growing and changing and loss, Bart Simpson has remained 10 years old. There is something in that which functions like grief, if you let it. The Simpsons froze Springfield at a particular moment in American life, and that moment has long since passed in the real world, but it has not passed in Springfield, and so there is always the option of going back there, of turning on the television and finding the family exactly as you left them, in exactly the same house, with exactly the same dynamics, as if no time has passed at all, which is, of course, the most powerful thing any story can offer. The promise that some things do not change, that some places endure, that somewhere there is a couch and a television and a family that will be exactly where you left them, no matter how much has happened in your life since you last visited. The floating timeline is not an accident or a convenience or a lazy shortcut. It is the core emotional promise of the show, baked into its structure so deeply that removing it would not change The Simpsons. It would destroy it. And every theory we will discuss tonight circles back to this central, unresolved, perhaps unresolvable mystery. Why has time stopped in Springfield? And what would happen if it ever started again? Let's keep moving. There is a long night ahead of us, and we are only at the beginning. If you are watching this late at night, or getting ready to drift off, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you are watching from. And if you want more of these deep dives, subscribe and you will never miss one. Now let's keep going. Section 2, the nuclear fog. Let's talk about the most obvious thing in Springfield, the thing that sits at the edge of every frame, visible from almost every outdoor location in the entire town, the thing that has been there since the very first episode and that the residents of Springfield have spent 3.5 decades not looking at directly. The cooling towers. 2 of them, enormous, curved at the top like a pair of concrete hourglasses, venting something into the air above them with a consistency that never changes. You can see them from the Simpson house. You can see them from Moe's Tavern. You can see them from Springfield Elementary. They are the permanent backdrop of this town, the feature of its skyline that distinguishes it from everywhere else, and they belong to a nuclear power plant that has been described, within the show's own dialogue, as one of the most dangerous industrial facilities in the history of American fiction. 342 safety violations. That number comes directly from the show, from an episode in which the plant receives a surprise inspection and the results are presented not as a dramatic twist, but as a punchline. 342 separate ways in which the Springfield nuclear power plant has failed to meet the minimum requirements for operating a facility that could irradiate an entire town. The estimated cost to bring the plant up to code was $56 million. Charles Montgomery Burns, the plant's owner and the wealthiest man in Springfield by an enormous margin, declined to pay it. Not because the money was beyond his reach by any reasonable estimate of his fortune. $56 million represents a rounding error, but because spending the money would mean acknowledging that the violations existed, and acknowledging the violations would raise the question of what those violations had already done to the people who had been living downwind of them for decades. So Burns did nothing. The violations remained, and the plant continued operating with cracked cooling towers patched with chewing gum, with radioactive waste being disposed of in ways that the show depicts with comedic casualness, but that, within the logic of the world it is describing, represent an ongoing environmental catastrophe of staggering scope. The waste does not go somewhere safe. It goes into the river. It goes onto the school playground, where children play on it, sometimes climbing on the barrels as if they are pieces of playground equipment. Plutonium sits on Homer Simpson's desk as a paperweight, the kind of casual familiarity with radioactive material that suggests the culture of the plant treats radiation not as a hazard to be managed, but as a feature of the work environment to be accommodated. And the safety inspector responsible for preventing all of this, the person whose literal professional function is to stand between the plant's operations and the surrounding community, is Homer Simpson. Homer has been described, by the show's own creator, Matt Groening, as having an IQ of approximately 55. He once discovered, in a medical examination, that a crayon had been lodged in his brain since childhood, a foreign object that had been physically reducing his cognitive function for decades, without anyone in Springfield's medical establishment noticing or addressing it. He falls asleep at his safety monitoring station. He eats during meltdown warnings. He has, on at least one occasion, caused a nuclear incident by throwing a donut into the reactor core to observe whether it would grow larger in the heat. This is the person standing between the residents of Springfield and radioactive catastrophe. He has held that position, by the show's own timeline, for the entirety of his adult working life. Now, most viewers absorb all of this as background comedy. The joke is clear. The incompetent man is responsible for the most dangerous job in town. The joke has been running for 36 years, and it still functions because the combination of Homer's specific brand of obliviousness and the genuine horror of what his job actually involves creates a kind of sustained dark comedy that the show never fully commits to and never fully walks away from. But what if the joke is not the point? What if the joke is the camouflage? Here is what the show has actually been showing you, steadily and without comment, since its second season. Season 2 gave Springfield its first visible mutant, Blinky, the three-eyed fish. Blinky was pulled from a river near the plant, a single specimen of what had evidently become a new biological reality in Springfield's waterways. The show treated this as a news event within its own universe. A gubernatorial candidate used the fish as campaign evidence that Burns was poisoning the environment. Burns was forced in a single memorable scene to eat the fish on live television to demonstrate its harmlessness. The town watched, processed what it had seen, and moved on. No follow-up water testing. No environmental impact study. No investigative journalism asking the obvious question. If the fish in the river nearest the plant have developed a third eye, what effect has that same water had on the people who have been drinking it? That question was left unanswered in Season 2, and it has remained unanswered in every season since. But the show has not been quiet about the answer. It has been showing it to you, steadily, in the specific physical characteristics of every Springfield resident who has lived in proximity to the plant long enough for the effect to become visible. The yellow skin, for one thing. Every person born and raised in Springfield has it. Not a warm golden tone, not a tan, a specific, deep, saturated yellow that appears nowhere else on the show except on the bodies of people who have spent their lives in Springfield. When visitors arrive from outside the town, guest characters, celebrities, federal agents, anyone who came from somewhere else, they are drawn with more natural skin tones. The contrast is subtle but consistent. Springfield's residents are a specific color, and people from outside Springfield are not that color. This has been attributed, by virtually everyone who has ever discussed it, to the show's art style. The characters are yellow because the show wanted them to be visually distinctive. The guest characters look different because they are being drawn to contrast with the regulars. It is a design choice, not a narrative clue, except that within the logic of the show's own universe, there is an observable, unexplained physical difference between people who live in Springfield and people who do not. The people inside the contamination zone present with a specific skin pigmentation. The people outside it present without it. The show has built this difference into its visual grammar and then encouraged you to dismiss it as a stylistic accident. But the yellow skin is only one detail. Look at the physical profiles of Springfield's long-term residents more carefully. Homer's skull shape defies normal human anatomy. His eyes protrude in a way that suggests significant physiological deviation from typical human ocular structure. He has 4 fingers on each hand, as do virtually all of Springfield's residents, a detail that the show has always treated as a universal cartoon convention, but that, applied consistently to an entire geographically isolated community, starts to look like something else entirely. Homer's capacity to absorb physical trauma is genuinely extraordinary. He has been shot, electrocuted, fallen from significant heights, been struck by vehicles, survived explosions, and walked away from every single one of these events with a recovery rate that no medical professional would describe as normal. His body heals at a rate and from injuries that should be fatal. His pain tolerance is not just high, it operates at a level that suggests his nervous system processes damage differently from a normal human being. These are not cartoon exaggerations applied to a single character. They are applied to a community. The Springfield residents, as a population, display physical characteristics that cluster in ways you would expect to see in an isolated group that has been subjected to a consistent environmental pressure over multiple generations. And Blinky is not an isolated case. The show established early that Springfield's ecosystem has been altered. The wildlife around the plant is visibly affected. The fish have developed extra organs. The local environment shows signs of sustained biological disruption. The show presents these facts, laughs at them, and moves on, but the facts remain present, building a picture that is impossible to ignore once you start assembling the pieces. Here is what makes the theory genuinely unsettling rather than just interesting. Burns knows, he has always known. The show makes this explicit in multiple episodes, never through a single dramatic confession, but through the accumulation of details about how Burns manages his own biology and his relationship to the plant he operates. In the episode known as The Springfield Files, the one where Homer encounters what he believes is an alien in the woods, the conclusion reveals that the glowing figure in the forest is not an extraterrestrial visitor. It is Burns. Burns has been undergoing a weekly medical treatment so intensive, so chemically and radiologically demanding, that it causes his body to emit a visible green glow in the hours after each session. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly 7 more days, after which he requires another dose. Without it, he will die. Let that settle for a moment. The man who owns a nuclear power plant, the man whose facility has been releasing radioactive material into the local environment for decades, personally depends on weekly radiation exposure to maintain biological function. His body has been so altered by his relationship with radioactive material that it can no longer sustain itself through normal cellular processes. He requires scheduled nuclear input the way a typical person requires food and water. Burns has, essentially, become a biological extension of the plant he operates, and his physician described his internal condition in a scene that the show played as pure comedy, but that, examined seriously, describes something extraordinary. Burns has every disease known to medical science simultaneously present in his body, every single one, all at once, in a state of perfect equilibrium where each illness prevents all the others from progressing, creating a kind of biological gridlock that makes him, paradoxically, functionally indestructible, despite being the sickest person alive. The doctor called it Three Stooges syndrome. The metaphor is funny. The underlying physiology is not. Burns's weekly treatments are maintaining that equilibrium. They are not curing his diseases. They are holding them in stasis, balanced against each other in a precise configuration that requires constant external management to sustain. Miss one treatment and the balance tips. One illness gains an advantage and the others follow, and everything that should have killed Burns decades ago finally gets its chance. This is not medicine. This is engineering. Burns's body is being maintained the way a reactor is maintained, through scheduled intervention, through the precise management of forces that would destroy everything if allowed to operate without control. And Burns understands this more deeply than anyone in Springfield, because Burns has spent a century studying what radioactive material does to biological systems, not as an academic exercise, not out of scientific curiosity, but because he is personally dependent on the answer. He lives inside the experiment. His survival depends on getting the chemistry right, which means he knows exactly what the chemistry has done to the people who live downwind of his plant. The most chilling aspect of the nuclear fog theory is not that Burns may have accidentally poisoned Springfield. It is that the evidence suggests the arrangement is not accidental at all. When German investors briefly purchased the plant during one memorable storyline, the first thing they did was fire Homer Simpson. They assessed the facility with fresh eyes, calculated the cost of addressing the violations, and nearly went bankrupt from the estimate alone. When Burns bought the plant back, he immediately rehired Homer. A competent safety inspector would have the plant shut down within a week. Homer's function at the plant is not, in any meaningful sense, to inspect safety. Homer's function is to ensure that the inspections produce no actionable results. His incompetence is the mechanism by which the violations continue. His continued employment is the structural guarantee that nothing will change. Burns needs the violations to continue because the violations are the source of his control over Springfield. The plant provides the town's electricity. Burns controls the plant. Springfield's economy depends entirely on the plant remaining operational. The population's cognitive function has been sufficiently impaired by decades of radiation exposure to prevent organized resistance. The town's medical establishment, if it has noticed any of this, has not acted on it. The crayon lodged in Homer's brain existed undetected through the entirety of his childhood, his adolescence, and most of his adult life, despite multiple interactions with Springfield's medical professionals. Either every doctor in town is extraordinarily incompetent, or the detection of that crayon was not considered a priority by whoever had influence over Homer's medical care. Burns had influence over Homer's medical care, Burns's deal with Homer's father, Grandpa Simpson, guaranteed Homer's continued employment at the plant. The details of what Burns got from Grandpa in return for that employment guarantee have been explored in separate episodes and point toward a pattern of Burns using his institutional reach to manage the people around him. Managing Homer would have been trivially easy for a man with Burns's resources, his connections to Springfield's institutional infrastructure, and his century of practice at keeping inconvenient truths from surfacing. The nuclear fog theory does not require Burns to be running a deliberate, consciously planned program of population management through radiation exposure. What it requires is that Burns, across decades of operating a dangerously non-compliant facility, made consistent choices about investment, about inspection results, about staffing, about the disposal of waste that served his interests over the interests of the people living around his plant, and that the cumulative effect of those choices has been to create exactly the kind of damaged, compliant, cognitively impaired population that is easiest to exploit and hardest to organize. Whether that was the plan from the beginning or the comfortable result of a century of self-interested decision-making almost does not matter. The outcome is the same either way. The town is irradiated. The residents are affected. The fish have 3 eyes. The children have yellow skin. The safety inspector is asleep at his station, and the cooling towers keep venting, quietly, into the air above a community that has been breathing that air for as long as anyone in Springfield can remember. And nobody looks up. Section 3. Homer's Coma and the Dream That Never Ended. This next theory is the one that, once you hear it, rewrites every episode you have ever watched. Not metaphorically, literally. If this theory is correct, then every single episode of The Simpsons that has aired since April of 1993 has been a dream. A specific dream, generated by a specific mind, for a specific reason that is so emotionally devastating that you almost wish you could unknow it after you have heard it. Let's go back to Season 4. On the 1st of April 1993, the 18th episode of Season 4 aired. It was called So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. The setup is simple. It's April Fool's Day. Bart has been playing a series of escalating pranks on Homer throughout the episode, and his final prank involves taking one of Homer's beer cans to an auto body shop, placing it inside an industrial paint shaker, and replacing it in the refrigerator. When Homer opens the can, the resulting explosion is violent enough to send him to the hospital. He is recovering in his hospital bed. He sees a vending machine across the room. He tries to get a candy bar. The machine tips over. It crushes him. He flatlines. Homer Simpson enters a clinically documented coma. The show is clear about this. It is not a dream sequence flagged as a dream sequence. It is not a cutaway gag with a "just kidding" button at the end. It is presented as a real event, with the appropriate medical weight family gathered around the bedside, the sound of machines, the particular silence of a hospital room, where someone's life is suspended between 2 possibilities. The episode ends with Homer waking up. Bart confesses tearfully at his bedside. Homer springs awake and begins strangling his son. The family laughs. Everything goes back to normal. But in the final moments of that same episode, the show reveals something that the laugh track seems designed to help you absorb without thinking about too carefully. Homer, upon waking, is informed by his doctors that he has lost 5% of his brain function during the coma. 5%, gone permanently, destroyed by the period of oxygen deprivation and neurological stress, never coming back. Homer's response to learning that he has suffered permanent brain damage is to laugh. He tells the family he does not know why he is laughing. The family finds this charming. Nobody finds it alarming. The episode ends. The next episode begins. And The Simpsons continues for 32 more years, as if that moment never happened. Unless it did not happen. Unless what the show presents as Homer waking up is actually the beginning of the dream. This is the Homer coma theory, and it has been the most debated, most dissected, most internally consistent fan theory in the history of the show for well over a decade. The basic premise is straightforward. Homer did not wake up from his coma in April 1993. Every single episode that has aired since that date exists inside the dreaming mind of a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General, losing brain function slowly, while his family sits in the waiting room and hopes. The evidence begins with tone. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was a specific kind of show. It was a family sitcom grounded in recognizable human pressures. Homer tried to quit drinking and could not. Marge considered what it would mean if she chose a different kind of life. Lisa developed a crush on a substitute teacher who treated her like an actual person and then left. The way people who treat you like an actual person sometimes leave. Bart struggled with school, with his grades, with the specific weight of being a kid who is smart enough to know he is underperforming, but not quite disciplined enough to do anything about it. These stories were told with jokes and with absurdist energy, but they were fundamentally rooted in the kind of domestic tension that real families experience. Financial pressure, the fear of not being enough, the complicated love between parents who are imperfect and children who need them to be better. After the coma episode, the show transforms. Homer goes to space, not as a joke, not as a dream sequence, but as an actual plot that unfolds over an actual episode with actual NASA involvement. Mr. Burns captures the Loch Ness Monster. Homer becomes the leader of a vigilante crime-fighting group. Homer joins a secret society with mysterious initiation rituals and ancient conspiracy connections. Homer discovers that his mother is a fugitive radical who has been living underground for decades to escape the man Homer works for. Homer meets God, twice. The escalation is not gradual. It is not the natural drift of a show that has been running long enough to run out of domestic story ideas. It is a categorical shift from a show grounded in the recognizable pressures of American family life to a show where anything can happen and often does, where the laws of plausibility are suspended wholesale in service of whatever the story requires in this particular episode. Fans noticed this shift a long time ago. The internet has been debating the precise moment when The Simpsons became a different show for decades, and the rough consensus settles somewhere around seasons 8 or 9, though the seeds of the transformation are visible earlier. The coma theory offers a more precise answer. The Simpsons did not become a different show. Homer's dreaming brain became more unstable. There is a particular detail that sits at the center of this theory like a quiet alarm. 6 months before the coma episode, in the season 4 premiere, an episode called Homer the Heretic Homer has a conversation with God. Not a dream of a conversation with God. Not a vision. A direct, face-to-face, two-way conversation with an entity the show presents without irony, as the actual divine presence that created the universe. And during that conversation, God tells Homer something. He tells him that Homer will learn the meaning of life, but not yet. He tells him that his time is coming, not in a threatening way in the tone of a parent telling a child that they are not quite old enough for something yet, but that the day is approaching. A gentle, significant warning that the current mode of existence is coming to an end, and something else is beginning. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. The timeline matches. God told Homer that his conscious life was approaching its conclusion, and 6 months later, Homer's conscious life apparently ended. What the show presented in the preceding months as a quirky theological subplot reads, under the coma theory, as a prophecy, a preparation, a gentle notice from the universe that what was coming next would be different from anything that had come before. And what came before is the dream. The aging problem, the floating timeline we discussed in the first section, acquires a completely different character under the coma theory. Nobody ages in The Simpsons because they exist inside the frozen mind of a man who went unconscious in April 1993 and never came back. Homer's brain cannot imagine his children growing older because he was not there to watch it happen. The last age he knew Bart to be was 10. The last age he knew Lisa to be was 8. The last version of Marge he carried with him into the coma was the woman she was at that specific moment in 1993. His brain has no subsequent reference material. It cannot update the picture because there are no new photographs to work from. The dream preserves the family at the exact moment Homer lost them. And this is the part of the coma theory that shifts it from intellectual puzzle to something that lands differently. Homer's deepest wish, the thing his dreaming mind returns to, again and again, across 32 years of episodes, is profoundly simple. He wants his family. He wants Marge to love him. He wants Bart to still be his mischievous, aggravating, desperately beloved son. He wants Lisa to play her saxophone in the house. He wants to hold Maggie, who is small enough to be held, who will always be small enough to be held as long as the dream keeps running. He wants Friday evening at 742 Evergreen Terrace to last forever. And in the coma, it does. The dream gives Homer precisely what he cannot have in the waking world. His family, frozen at the moment he loved them most, preserved with the fidelity of memory, immune to the passage of time. The world around them changes because Homer's comatose brain is absorbing fragments of the external environment, sounds from a hospital television, voices from the hallway, news broadcasts bleeding through the fog of unconsciousness, and incorporating them into the dream as new story elements. That is why later seasons are flooded with celebrity guest appearances and references to current technology and contemporary events. Homer's brain is pulling from whatever it can receive through the walls of the hospital room and weaving it into the narrative that keeps him company in the dark. The celebrity who shows up in Springfield is a voice Homer heard. The political scandal that becomes a plot point is something that filtered through the hospital room television. The technological gadget that appears in a later episode is something someone mentioned while standing at his bedside. Homer is not writing the dream. He is dreaming it, from whatever material his receiving mind can gather in the particular silence of a long unconsciousness. The show has acknowledged this theory, not directly, not with the full weight of canonical confirmation, but it acknowledged it. In season 34, an episode included what was described as a deliberately leaked, fake deleted scene in which Homer wakes up from a long coma, stares around a hospital room, and realizes that every outlandish episode since his accident has been a dream. The show's writers created this scene, animated it fully, gave it a complete voice performance, and then immediately told the audience that it was a hoax, a piece of fabricated content planted by fictional hackers to spread a false theory. They showed you Homer waking up from a coma and told you it was not real. The fact that they made it at all, that they chose to engage with the theory at that level of specificity, tells you something important. The writers know the theory. They have spent real creative energy engaging with it. They understood its internal logic well enough to construct a scene that directly addressed it, and then they wrapped that scene in a denial that anyone who has followed the theory closely enough will recognize as exactly the kind of thing you would construct if you wanted to keep the dream going. Homer's brain, at the end of that scene, refusing to wake up, the simulation reasserting itself. The reset button pressed one more time. Executive producer Al Jean addressed the theory directly in 2015. He said it is not true. He said Homer did not stay in the coma. He called it fan speculation and moved on. He did not explain the tonal shift. He did not explain why nobody ages. He did not explain what God meant when he told Homer his time was coming. He did not address why the show becomes progressively more surreal and detached from realistic human experience with each passing season, in exactly the pattern you would expect from a dreaming brain that is slowly losing coherence over time. He just said it is not true, and the conversation moved to other things. The coma theory does not ruin The Simpsons if it is true. It transforms it. It takes every absurd plot, every impossible recovery, every reset that erases a catastrophe before the next episode begins, and it frames them as something achingly human. A man who cannot let go. A mind that keeps the story running because the alternative to the story is something he is not ready to face. Every time Homer survives something that should kill him, it is because his body is in a hospital bed and nothing is actually happening to it. Every time the world resets to normal after a disaster, it is because Homer's brain needs it to. Every time the credits roll and the family is intact and the house is standing and everything is fine, that is not the writing staff being lazy about consequences. That is Homer's unconscious mind insisting that the story is not over yet. Because if the story ends, Homer has to wake up. And waking up means opening his eyes in a hospital room and finding out how much time has passed. It means learning how old his children actually are. It means discovering whether Marge waited, whether anyone is still by his side, whether there is still something to come back to, or whether the world has moved on to a place he does not recognize. The coma theory posits that Homer chose the dream. Not in any moment of conscious decision-making you do not choose the shape of a coma, but in the way that the body sometimes holds on longer than it has any biological reason to, in the way that people sometimes refuse to surface from unconsciousness until something in them is ready. Homer chose this particular dream, in this particular world, with this particular family, and has been holding on to it for 32 years, because the dream gives him everything. His children who never grow up and never leave home, his wife who is always there, his house on Evergreen Terrace that is always warm and always recognizable, the beer in the refrigerator that is always cold, the couch that is always waiting. Everything Homer Simpson has ever wanted, preserved in the amber of a coma dream, perfect and permanent and impossible to lose. That is either the most comforting story the show has ever told or the saddest. Possibly both. Section 4, Who Really Shot Mr. Burns. The The summer of 1995 belongs, in the memory of American television, to a single question: who shot Mr. Burns? It was not the first time a primetime drama had used a cliffhanger mystery as a season-ending device. It was not even the first time that particular framing a shooting, a wealthy villain, a crowd of suspects had appeared on American television. Dallas had done it 15 years earlier with J.R. Ewing, and the cultural footprint of that particular mystery had been so enormous that its echo was still audible a decade and a half later. But what The Simpsons did in the summer of 1995 was different from anything an animated show had attempted before, and different from most things any scripted show had attempted either. It was not just a cliffhanger. It was a genuine, constructed mystery, with deliberate clues planted throughout the episode, with a national contest inviting viewers to submit their guesses, with a cash prize and the promise of being animated into a future episode for the person who got it right. Fox promoted it like a cultural event. America's Most Wanted produced a special segment treating the fictional crime as a real, unsolved case. The show had for one summer convinced a significant portion of America to take a cartoon shooting seriously. And then the answer came. September 1995, Part 2 aired. And the resolution of the most elaborate mystery in animated television history was this: the shooter was Maggie Simpson, an infant, a one-year-old baby who had encountered Mr. Burns in a parking lot, been involved in a struggle over her lollipop, and during the resulting scuffle had picked up the gun that fell from Burns's own holster and fired it in his direction. Case closed. Baby did it. Move on. Except the case was never actually closed. And the more carefully you examine the resolution, the more it becomes clear that the official answer was not the conclusion of a mystery so much as the closing of a file that still had questions inside it. Let's start with the contest. Fox invited viewers across America to submit their guesses. Thousands of entries arrived. The show's writing staff, according to DVD commentary recorded years after the episode aired, examined a sample of those entries. Among the randomly selected pool, not a single person had guessed the correct answer. The prize winner was chosen at random from the pool and, since they had not guessed correctly, was given a cash payment instead of the animated appearance that had been promised. There was, the producers confirmed, exactly one person who had posted the correct answer online on a Simpsons news group on the night the first part aired. This person was using a college internet account. By the time the contest ended and the producers looked for them, the account was inactive. They could not locate them. They issued an open invitation on the DVD release for this person to come forward, and as far as anyone publicly knows, they never did. So, a mystery designed and promoted as solvable from the clues in Part 1 was solved in a public submission pool of thousands by exactly 0 people in a randomly selected sample. The one person who got it right has never been publicly identified. And the show's creators, in acknowledging all of this on the DVD commentary, seem not particularly troubled by what it implies. What it implies is that the clues, as presented, did not actually point to the correct answer in any clear way. The mystery was not solved from the evidence. The evidence was assembled, after the fact, to support the answer the writers had chosen. The mystery was reverse engineered. Now let's look at the specific evidence. When Burns collapses at the town sundial, his hands land on 2 letters, W and S. The show later interprets this as M and S, Maggie Simpson's initials, because, from Burns's perspective, lying on the dial with his hands above him, the letters would appear inverted, M for Maggie, S for Simpson. The clue points to the shooter. Except Burns himself, when he regains consciousness, explicitly states that his hands landing on those letters was not intentional. He did not position himself to point at his attacker's initials. He just fell. The sundial clue, the central visual element that the show uses to justify its answer, was explicitly disclaimed by the victim as a coincidence. The most important clue in the show's own mystery was described by the person it supposedly came from as meaningless. Then there is the matter of Burns's last words before being shot. He said, "Oh, it's you," not in a tone of shock or alarm, in a tone of recognition, the kind of mild acknowledgement you might offer to someone you know slightly but do not consider a threat. Someone you have encountered before and whose presence in your current location is mildly surprising but not alarming. Does Mr. Burns recognize Maggie Simpson? Has he, prior to this episode, Had any meaningful interaction with her that would cause him to greet her at a parking lot encounter with calm familiarity? The show does not establish any prior relationship between Burns and Maggie. Burns struggles to remember the name of Homer Simpson, his direct employee of many years. The idea that he would see an infant in a parking lot and respond with the particular warmth of, "Oh, it's you," as if greeting a familiar acquaintance strains the character's established personality considerably. Burns saying, "Oh, it's you," to Maggie makes sense only if Burns had a specific prior reason to expect her, to recognize her, or to feel the particular mixture of surprise and familiarity that phrase implies. None of that is established. But "oh, it's you" makes immediate sense if the shooter was someone Burns knew well. Someone whose presence in that parking lot at that moment would have caused him genuine surprise combined with the casual recognition of long familiarity. Someone perhaps whose motives he would have understood, and whose identity he might have chosen, for personal reasons, to conceal in his subsequent account. The Homer theory is worth considering before anything else, because the show itself raises it in the most casual way possible. Season 18. Homer, in the middle of an unrelated conversation, claims that he was the one who shot Burns. He says it out loud, on camera, with no particular dramatic framing. Nobody investigates. Nobody takes it seriously. The plot moves on. This is either a throwaway joke about Homer's tendency to claim credit for dramatic events, or it is the show quietly, almost invisibly, suggesting that the official answer was wrong all along, and that the man who actually pulled the trigger has been living down the street from the victim for the past 2 decades. If Homer did it, the DNA evidence that pointed to a Simpson is explained correctly. The DNA was Simpson DNA. It just belonged to Homer, not to Maggie. The fingerprints on the gun make sense. The motive is the strongest of any character in Springfield. Homer had been humiliated for years by a man who could not be bothered to learn his name, who dismissed him completely as a person, and who represented the accumulated indignity of Homer's entire working life. And if Homer did it, Maggie was not just absolved, she was framed. A baby was blamed for her father's crime, and the case was closed on the basis that no jury in the world would convict an infant, which conveniently also ensured that the real shooter would never be prosecuted. The Marge theory is, in some ways, even more compelling. The evidence for Marge as the shooter was assembled by a Reddit user whose argument has been discussed and dissected for years. The core of it is this: Burns destroyed everything that mattered to Marge. He cut the funding to her children's school. He injured the family dog. He stole the sun from the entire town, an act of singular environmental vandalism that threatened every living thing in Springfield, including her children. Marge is not a passive character. She is someone who responds with force when the things she loves are threatened, and in the summer preceding the shooting, Burns had threatened virtually everything she loved. And Burns, crucially, fell in love with Marge during an earlier episode, an episode in which he pursued her romantically with the single-minded intensity that characterizes his approach to everything he wants. A man who was that focused on Marge, who had spent that much emotional energy on his feelings for her, would have reasons to protect her that he would not have for almost anyone else in Springfield. When Burns woke from his coma and identified his shooter, he could have pointed at Marge. The evidence, if it was going to point at anyone, pointed at Marge as readily as at Maggie. He chose not to. He gestured at the sundial, let the town draw its own conclusions, and protected the woman he had once loved by redirecting the investigation toward an infant who could never be convicted. There is also the matter of the alternate ending. A complete alternate conclusion was animated, fully voiced, fully produced, in which Smithers is revealed as the shooter. This ending was shown in the show's clip episode hosted by Troy McClure, who dismisses it by saying it would not have made sense because all the Simpson DNA evidence would have to be ignored, which would be, in his words, downright nutty. That line about ignoring DNA evidence is a direct reference to the O.J. Simpson trial, which was dominating American cultural consciousness at exactly the time these episodes were produced. A jury had recently ignored DNA evidence to reach an acquittal, and the show was pointing at that fact directly in the context of its own mystery. The show is telling you that ignoring DNA evidence happens. It is telling you that official conclusions and actual truth are not always the same thing. It is winking at you through the fourth wall in the clearest possible way, while the character on screen earnestly argues for the official version. An early draft of the script had Barney Gumble as the shooter. The writers considered this seriously enough to develop it before abandoning it. The answer was not fixed in advance. The clues were written first, and then the shooter was chosen to fit them, or perhaps more accurately, the clues were adjusted to fit the shooter once the shooter was chosen. The mystery, in other words, was not a puzzle that had a single correct solution derived from the evidence. It was a creative choice made in the writer's room, after the fact, wrapped in the appearance of inevitability. And the choice of Maggie, the choice of the infant, the person least capable of being prosecuted, least capable of defending herself or contradicting the official account, least capable of providing an alternative narrative, is either the most honest answer or the most convenient one. In Springfield, those are rarely the same thing. The official answer remains Maggie Simpson. The show committed to it, the writers stand behind it, and the DVD commentary treats the case as settled. But the one clue that Burns described as accidental, the one confession that was never investigated, the one alternate ending that was fully animated, and the one final shot of Maggie in an empty room moving her pacifier like a trigger, all of that suggests something that Springfield knows how to do very well. Closing a case is not the same as solving it. Section 5. The immortality of Charles Montgomery Burns. Charles Montgomery Burns was born somewhere in the late 19th century. The show is not entirely consistent about the specific year. Different episodes place his birth at different points in the 1800s, and the writers have generally treated continuity around Burns's age the way they treat continuity around most things in Springfield as a general suggestion rather than a firm commitment. But by the most conservative estimate possible, taking the most recent birth year that any episode has ever implied, Burns is well over 100 years old. By the more generous readings of his established biography, he may be significantly older than that. He remembers the Spanish-American War as a personal experience. He has described the Gilded Age not as history but as something he lived through. He attended Yale and has described his college years with the specificity of someone who was there. He served in World War II, though in a capacity that the show declines to examine too closely. He had a personal relationship with Howard Hughes. He knew Theodore Roosevelt. This is a man who has been alive through the invention of the airplane, through 2 world wars, through the atomic age, through the space race, through the digital revolution, and through whatever comes after the digital revolution. He has watched empires rise and fall. He has seen technologies move from science fiction to obsolescence within a single human lifetime, and he has experienced that single human lifetime several times over. And he runs, right now, in the show's perpetual present, a functioning multi-billion-dollar corporation with the cognitive sharpness of someone a fraction of his age. His body is frail. The show has always been clear about this. His physical strength is minimal to non-existent. He can be knocked over by a stiff breeze. He requires assistance navigating environments that present no particular challenge to a typical elderly person. His grip, famously, is insufficient to crush a paper cup. Physically, Burns is at the far end of the spectrum of human fragility. But his mind is something else entirely. Burns operates with a strategic intelligence that no one in Springfield can match. His schemes are elaborate, multi-step operations that require sustained planning across extended timeframes, the management of multiple variables, an understanding of modern financial systems and legal structures and municipal politics, and the particular ruthlessness of someone who has spent over a century identifying the precise points at which institutions can be leveraged or circumvented. He is not just smart. He is calibrated to power in a way that only a very long education in its exercise could produce. And he has been operating at that level of cognitive function for longer than the United States has been a superpower. The Springfield Files episode, which we have already visited in the context of the radiation theory, provides the most explicit in-universe explanation for how Burns remains alive. The weekly medical treatment, the precise, regularly scheduled intervention that produces the green glow and maintains his biological equilibrium for exactly 7 more days. Miss one treatment and Burns dies. The margin for error is 0. His survival is not a function of biological resilience or natural longevity. It is a logistical operation, maintained with the same precision that his plant uses to keep its reactor stable. Smithers is the critical element in this operation. The show's depiction of Smithers has always emphasized his devotion to Burns as something approaching the pathological, a loyalty so complete and so encompassing that it defines every dimension of his life. But the coma theory and the immortality theory together suggest that Smithers' devotion is not purely emotional. It is functional. Smithers manages Burns' treatment schedule, Smithers monitors Burns's physical condition. Smithers is the person who ensures that Burns gets to each weekly appointment, who knows the logistics of the medical protocol, who would recognize the signs of a missed treatment and intervene. Without Smithers, Burns would miss a dose. Without the dose, the equilibrium collapses. Every disease in his body, currently held in perfect mutual stasis, would surge forward simultaneously. And Burns, who has survived gunshots and hospitalization and a century of gradual biological deterioration, would be overwhelmed by the accumulated weight of every illness he has somehow managed to hold at bay. Smithers is not just devoted to Burns. Smithers is keeping Burns alive through logistical competence, and he knows it. That knowledge is the foundation of their relationship, sitting beneath everything else, like bedrock beneath the professional attachment, beneath whatever personal feelings Smithers carries, beneath the specific comedy of their dynamic. Smithers knows that if he leaves, Burns dies. And whatever else is true about Smithers, he has never left. There is a question that the Burns immortality theory opens without answering, one that the show has gestured at in various episodes without ever committing to a full examination. Is Burns unique? The Burns family dynasty, as the show has described it across various episodes, predates the Industrial Revolution. The family wealth is old enough that its origins are genuinely murky, not the kind of wealth built in a single generation of remarkable business acumen, but the kind that accumulates over so many generations of compound interest and institutional influence that it stops being attributable to any particular person or decision and starts being a feature of the landscape. The Burns family has been wealthy for a very long time, longer potentially than the United States has been a country. And if the current Burns has been alive for over a century through artificial means, through medical technology and radioactive treatments, and the precise management of his own deteriorating biology, it is worth asking whether previous Burns patriarchs employed similar strategies. Whether the family's extraordinary persistence across generations is a function of wise financial management and fortunate inheritance, or whether the Burns family has a longer history with longevity extension than any of them have publicly acknowledged. The show does not answer this. It does not even directly raise it, but it establishes across multiple episodes that the Burns family has maintained continuous control over its fortune for long enough that the concept of generational wealth barely applies. Most wealthy families see their fortunes dissipated within 3 or 4 generations. The Burns dynasty shows no signs of that pattern. The money stays concentrated, the institutional control stays in place, the name stays at the top. Something has held it there. The show implies it is Burns's personal involvement. But a man who is over 100 years old, surviving through weekly medical intervention, is not the same as a family maintaining wealth across natural generational succession. Burns is not handing anything down. Burns is holding everything himself because he has not died yet. And the question of whether he will ever die is one the show has been dancing around for 36 years without landing. There is another dimension to Burns's relationship with death that the immortality theory illuminates in an interesting way. Burns has come close to dying more times than almost any other character in the show. He has been shot, hospitalized, collapsed, been abandoned in dangerous environments, been subjected to conditions that would have killed any ordinary person multiple times over. And every time, he comes back. Not through the kind of cartoonish resilience that allows Homer to survive falls and explosions and electrocutions. Homer's survival is, within the coma theory, explicable as the dream simply protecting its dreamer. Burns's survival operates differently. Burns survives through infrastructure, through money, through the fact that his wealth has purchased enough medical capability and enough loyal assistance that no matter what happens to his body, there is always someone standing by with the resources to address it. Homer survives because the dream needs him to. Burns survives because he has spent a century building a system designed to ensure his survival, regardless of the circumstances. Homer's immortality is passive. Burns's immortality is engineered. Every dollar, every institution, every corrupted official and retained physician and managed treatment schedule serves a single ultimate purpose: keep Burns operational. Keep the reactor running, keep the man alive. Because if Burns dies, his empire answers for what it has done. The plant gets examined by people who are not invested in looking the other way. The violations get addressed. The water gets tested. The town gets a genuine assessment of what has been happening to it, biologically and environmentally, for decades. Burns cannot die because his death would trigger an accounting that he has spent a century making sure never happens. And the town cannot afford for him to die either. Springfield's economy, what little of it functions, runs on the plant. The plant runs on Burns. Burns runs on the treatments. Remove Burns and the economic structure of the entire town collapses, which means the people who would most benefit from Burns being held accountable are also the people who depend most directly on his continued functioning. The system is closed. It feeds itself. Burns, the plant, the town, the workforce, each element depends on the others in a loop that has no natural exit point. Burns is too expensive to die, and Springfield is too dependent to stop paying the bill. The oldest man in Springfield sits at the center of this loop, glowing faintly from his weekly treatment, remembering wars that the youngest people around him have only read about in history classes, and managing an empire that was already ancient when most of Springfield's current residents were born. He is not immortal in the classical sense. He has not discovered a philosophical stone or made a bargain with a supernatural entity. He is simply wealthy enough and organized enough and ruthless enough to have built a system that replaces every failing biological function with a technological or financial solution indefinitely for as long as he can maintain the resources to sustain it. Which, given that he controls the economy of the only town that knows his secrets, may in fact be forever. Section 6. Maggie Simpson and the silence that knows everything. There is a member of the Simpson family who has been watching everything for 36 years. She has not said a word. She has not walked reliably. She has communicated almost exclusively through the specific language of pacifier sounds and an extremely expressive pair of eyes that, if you pay close attention, miss absolutely nothing. She is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for the entirety of the show's run, and in that time, without a single sentence, she has accomplished more than every other member of her family by a significant margin. She shot a billionaire. She organized a rebellion in her daycare center, outmaneuvering an authoritarian caretaker with the strategic sophistication of someone who has studied the layout, identified the power structures, built alliances among the other infants, and executed a coordinated action that succeeded completely. She has saved her family from multiple life-threatening situations through displays of problem-solving ability that exceed those of adults 3 times her age. She was tested, in one episode, and found to possess intelligence that the testing apparatus could not adequately measure, an intelligence that exceeded the scale designed to assess it. And through all of it, through every remarkable thing she has ever done, every display of capability that should have triggered a fundamental reassessment of what this particular baby actually is, she maintains her silence. She watches. She waits. And the people around her, consistently and completely, fail to register what they are looking at. The shooting is the act that everyone knows about, so let's spend a moment with the aftermath rather than the event itself, because the aftermath is where Maggie reveals something important. After Burns identified his shooter, after the investigation concluded and Chief Wiggum confirmed that no jury anywhere would convict an infant for anything, after every adult in the scene had processed the resolution and moved on to whatever came next, there is a final shot. Everyone has left the room. Maggie is alone. She looks around the space with a slow, deliberate scan, checking, not glancing, the specific attentiveness of someone who wants to confirm that no observation is occurring before proceeding. And then she moves her pacifier in a precise, contained motion that mimics pulling a trigger. The show presents this as confirmation. Maggie did it and knows she did it. The baby is self-aware about the shooting in a way that closes the case. But there is another reading. Babies imitate. It is their primary learning mechanism. They watch the adults around them and reproduce the behaviors they observe. Not because they fully understand the significance of those behaviors, but because repetition is how the infant brain builds models of the world. A baby who watched someone fire a gun might, hours or days later, reproduce that motion while alone, not as an admission of guilt, not as private gloating, but as the processing of a witnessed event through the body. If Maggie did not fire the gun but watched someone else do it, the final scene reads completely differently. She checked to make sure she was alone. Then she privately reproduced the motion she saw. Not confessing, remembering. She witnessed the shooting, she understood that the information was significant, and she understood that revealing what she knew would have consequences that she was not yet ready to navigate. A 1-year-old baby having that level of strategic awareness about the social management of sensitive information is, of course, not something that a typical infant is capable of, which is precisely the point. Maggie is not a typical infant. The 2012 short film The Longest Daycare is 7 minutes long and is the most direct, sustained examination of Maggie's capabilities that the show has ever offered. It was nominated for an Academy Award, and what it depicts is a 1-year-old baby conducting a complex, multi-step rescue operation within a daycare facility, navigating institutional security, identifying threats, developing responsive strategies in real time, and executing a plan that succeeds entirely through her own assessment of the environment and her own adaptive problem-solving. She does all of this without speaking. She does it entirely through observation, inference, and action. Every step she takes in that short film demonstrates a cognitive capacity that is extraordinary even by adult standards. She reads environments. She models other people's behavior and predicts their responses. She makes tactical adjustments mid-execution. She maintains a clear objective through a sequence of complications. She does not panic, and she does not hesitate. She assesses each obstacle as it appears and routes around it with a fluency that most adults would struggle to match in a situation of equivalent complexity. And her body barely keeps up. She falls. She crawls when she needs to move quickly. Iki is physically limited to the motor capabilities of a 1-year-old, which are significant limitations. Her intelligence consistently exceeds the capacity of her physical form to express it. She is, in a very real sense, trapped in a body that cannot adequately demonstrate what is happening inside it. Now look at Lisa Simpson. Lisa is the character the show has always used to represent intelligence in this family: brilliant, articulate, fiercely principled, and consistently, painfully unable to translate that intelligence into any form of lasting influence over the world around her. She speaks and is ignored. She challenges and is dismissed. She tries to improve things and encounters the specific, grinding resistance of a community that does not want to be improved by someone who is 8 years old and knows it is smarter than they are. Lisa's intelligence is her most visible characteristic. She leads with it. She wears it like a flag. She announces herself as the person in the room who has thought about this more carefully than anyone else has, and the room responds with the particular indifference that Springfield applies to anything that makes its residents feel inadequate. Maggie has been watching this happen since she was born. She has watched her sister, the most intelligent person in the family by a considerable margin, spend every day fighting for recognition and receiving instead dismissal, mockery, and the specific exhaustion of being right in a world that is not interested in right answers. She has observed the precise dynamics of what happens when intelligence is visible in this particular household, in this particular community, in this particular town where the social rewards flow not toward insight, but toward compliance. And she has reached a different conclusion than Lisa reached. Silence is protection. Invisibility is a strategy. The less they notice you, the more you can accomplish. Look at what Maggie has actually done in the course of the show's run. She shot the wealthiest, most powerful man in Springfield and faced zero consequences because nobody suspects an infant. She organized her peers in a complete rebellion against an authority figure and succeeded because nobody monitors babies closely enough to watch them coordinate. Every time Maggie has acted, she has acted below the threshold of scrutiny that Springfield applies to its residents. She has operated in the margins, in the spaces where attention does not reach, and every operation she has conducted from those margins has succeeded. That is not coincidence. That is a strategy so well designed that it looks like innocence. The question of what Maggie is actually waiting for is the last genuinely open question in the Simpson family's narrative. Every other character's arc is, in some sense, established. Homer has his job and his family and his permanent mid-30s, and the specific dimensions of contentment and frustration that those things produce. Marge has her patience and her complexity and the life she built inside the constraints she was given. Bart has his rebellion and his cleverness and the particular trajectory of a charming troublemaker who may or may not eventually find something worth caring about. Lisa has her saxophone and her crusades and the long, slow education and disappointment that the world provides to idealists. Maggie has nothing established. Maggie's future is completely unwritten. She is the only character whose potential has not been even partially defined by 36 years of storytelling, because the potential has been kept hidden, deliberately, behind a silence that nobody in her family has thought to question. There is a theory not widely circulated, more of a whispered inference than a formal argument that Maggie's silence is less about strategic protection and more about understanding. That she has been watching Springfield long enough and with sufficient clarity to have arrived at conclusions about this town that nobody else has been able to reach. That her silence is the silence of someone who knows something that would be dangerous to say out loud. That she has put together the pieces, the plant, burns, the radiation, the pattern of who is allowed to thrive and who is kept manageable, and understood the architecture of what has been done to her family and her community. And that she is waiting, not because she does not know what to do about it, but because she is waiting for the right moment to do it. 36 years of watching, 36 years of silence, 36 years of checking the room before moving, of operating below the threshold of observation, of building whatever it is she is building in the spaces where nobody is paying attention, behind those enormous eyes, behind the pacifier, behind the blank-faced presentation that everyone around her reads as the simple vacancy of infancy, something is thinking. And eventually, when the moment is right, when the conditions are aligned in whatever way Maggie has decided they need to be, Maggie Simpson is going to speak. And nobody in Springfield is going to be ready for what she says. Section 7. Mona Simpson and the Conspiracy That Built Homer. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. That was the official story, and it was a story that shaped everything about Homer without anyone having to acknowledge that it was shaping him. The absence of Mona Simpson was the invisible architecture of her son's personality. It explained why he needed Marge's approval so completely. It explained why he clung to his family with a desperation that occasionally curdled into smothering. It explained why he could not leave his job, even when his job was humiliating and dangerous and run by a man who could not be bothered to learn his name. It explained why, at the deepest level, Homer Simpson was afraid that if he pushed too hard against anything, if he made himself too inconvenient, or too demanding, or too present, the people around him would conclude that the inconvenience was not worth it and leave. Homer's entire emotional profile is the profile of someone who was taught very early that his worth was contingent and conditional, and who spent the rest of his life performing adequacy for an audience that he perpetually feared would stop watching. And in Season 7, the show revealed that the death of Homer's mother was a lie. The episode is called Mother Simpson, and it aired in November 1995, and it is considered one of the greatest episodes the show has ever produced. The revelation it offers is almost unbearably simple. His mother never died. His father made it up. The grave Homer had spent his entire life believing was hers was actually the grave of a 19th-century poet whose headstone Abe Simpson had repurposed as the prop for a deception he maintained for 27 years. Mona Simpson was alive. She had been alive the entire time. She had simply been unable to come home. The reason connects directly to Charles Montgomery Burns. In 1969, Mona was a Springfield housewife. She was ordinary and unremarkable, and living a quiet, unremarkable life while the world outside was burning through the counterculture and the civil rights movement and the protests against Vietnam. Something changed. The show depicts it with its characteristic mixture of absurdity and genuine emotional weight. Mona was radicalized. She joined a group of activists, and their target was a biological weapons laboratory owned by Burns. Not a nuclear power plant, a germ warfare facility. A laboratory designed to produce weaponized pathogens in a residential community in the same town where Homer was growing up, in the same town where children were playing outside and families were going about the business of ordinary life, with no idea that the richest man in the area was cooking up diseases in a building down the road. Mona and her group broke into the lab. They destroyed the biological agent stored there. In the chaos of the raid, Mona made a single mistake. She stopped to help someone who had been knocked over in the confusion. That someone was Burns. She helped him up. He saw her face. He identified her to the FBI, and from that moment, Mona Simpson was a fugitive. She could not go home. She could not contact her husband or hold her son or explain to a 6-year-old boy why she was leaving. She kissed Homer while he slept and disappeared into the night. And the next morning, Homer woke up without a mother and grew up without an explanation and spent the next 27 years believing that something about him had caused his mother to leave. The psychological damage of that is difficult to overstate. A child who loses a parent to death grieves, processes, and eventually imperfectly, incompletely, but actually moves forward. A child who loses a parent to an unexplained departure, who is told the departure was death when it was actually abandonment, builds a different kind of wound. A wound that never properly heals, because it cannot be properly grieved, because the story around it is wrong, because the narrative the child uses to understand what happened to their family is built on a foundation that is not true. Homer grew up believing he was the kind of son whose mother would rather vanish than stay. He grew up carrying that belief in his body, in his specific brand of self-sabotaging neediness and terror of rejection, and that belief shaped everything: his tolerance for Burns's contempt, his inability to demand better treatment, his desperate attachment to any scrap of approval or recognition that came his way. Burns did not just destroy Mona's life, he engineered Homer's. By driving Mona away when Homer was 6 years old, Burns ensured that Homer would reach adulthood emotionally damaged in precisely the ways that made him the ideal employee. Compliant, terrified of losing his job, unable to organize resistance, grateful for whatever small acknowledgement came his way. Unable to look at the man who signed his checks and connect that man to the loss that had defined his entire personality. When Mona returns to Springfield in season 7, Burns recognizes her almost immediately. He has carried her face in his memory for 27 years with the particular intensity of someone nursing a specific grievance, and when she appears in a taxi window, he acts instantly. The FBI arrives at the Simpson house. Mona has to flee again. Homer says goodbye to his mother for the second time, and this time he understands why. This time he knows who drove her away. He knows that the man who stole his mother is the same man who employs him, who manages his career, who has shaped the context of his entire adult working life. And he does nothing about it. He does not confront Burns. He does not quit. He does not even seem to fully register the connection between these two facts, that the man who runs the plant destroyed his family. Homer's inability to make this connection is not played as a character failing in the conventional sense. It is played as tragedy because Homer is not capable of making this connection. His brain does not work that way. The cognitive damage from the crayon and the radiation, and the decades of living in Springfield, has impaired precisely the functions required to hold two separate facts in mind simultaneously and trace the logical path between them. He experiences his grief and his employment as separate things, unconnected, because the part of his brain that connects things has been systematically undermined. Burns knows this too. There is a later episode in which Burns's deal with Grandpa Simpson is revealed. Burns had committed a crime. Abe had witnessed it, and in exchange for Abe's silence, Burns guaranteed Homer's employment at the plant regardless of performance. 742 documented safety errors, and Homer was never permanently fired because the deal protected him. Homer's job security was not a cartoon convenience. It was a contractual arrangement between his father and the man who had destroyed his mother. Think about the geometry of that. Abe made a deal with the man who drove Mona away. The deal protected Homer by giving him permanent employment. The employment put Homer in daily proximity to Burns. And Homer, cognitively impaired by a combination of environmental exposure and physical brain damage, was unable to recognize the pattern that placed him in that position. He showed up to work every day at the plant of the man who stole his childhood, and he never knew, and Burns never told him, and Abe never told him, and the deal sat quietly beneath the surface of Homer's working life for decades, invisible and complete. Burns broke a family 3 generations back and used the wreckage to build a workforce. Mona died in a later season. The episode does not provide the specific details the show's comedic framework usually generates at moments of high emotion. It provides a man sitting beside a dying woman, holding her hand, in a room without jokes. The weight of 27 stolen years, compressed into a final quiet exchange between a mother and a son who found each other too late and lost each other again before they had time to make anything right. Homer chose to put the crayon back in. He chose the fog. But the choice was rigged before he ever made it. He was never meant to see clearly in Springfield. Burns made sure of that when Homer was 6 years old, when a woman kissed her sleeping son goodbye and walked into the night rather than put him in danger. The Simpsons is a comedy. It has always been a comedy, but underneath the jokes and the couch gags and the donuts and the 36 years of Homer falling down and getting back up, there is a story about a family that was systematically dismantled by one man's decision to protect his biological weapons program at any cost. Mona fought back and lost everything. Abe made a deal with the devil and buried the truth. Homer inherited the consequences and spent his life not understanding why everything felt heavier than it should. And Burns won. Burns always wins. Because in Springfield, the man with the money and the century of practice shapes the rules. And the rules have always been designed to keep Homer Simpson in Sector 7G and everyone else exactly where they belong. Section 8, The Principal Who Wasn't, and Springfield's War on Truth. There is an episode of The Simpsons that its fans hate more than almost any other. Not because it is poorly written, though many of them argue it is, but because of what it reveals about the show, about Springfield, and about the particular way that this community handles information that threatens to make everyone uncomfortable. The episode is called The Principal and the Pauper. It aired in September 1997. It has been consistently ranked among the worst episodes in the series, sometimes the single worst, by polls and critical assessments and the general consensus of people who have strong opinions about animated television. Here is what happens. Springfield Elementary holds an event honoring Principal Seymour Skinner for 20 years of service. During the celebration, a stranger arrives, a man nobody recognizes, who introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner, the real Seymour Skinner, a decorated Vietnam War veteran who was captured as a prisoner of war, presumed dead, and who has spent the intervening years working his way back to a life that, when he finally reaches it, he discovers has been occupied by someone else entirely. The man Springfield has known for 20 years as Principal Skinner is an imposter. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. Before Vietnam, he was a street kid, a petty criminal, a young man from nowhere with no particular future. He was drafted, served in the same unit as the real Skinner, and when Skinner was captured and believed dead, Tamzarian felt guilty. He traveled to Springfield to deliver the news of Skinner's death to his mother, Agnes. Agnes assumed he was her son. Agnes needed him to be her son. And Tamzarian, who had never had a family or a home or an identity worth carrying, simply accepted it. He became Seymour Skinner. He took the name, the rank, the life, the relationship with Agnes, and the career that came with all of it. He maintained the deception for 20 years, until the real Skinner walked through the door and the entire architecture of his borrowed life collapsed. Now, here is where Springfield does something that the fans who hate this episode almost universally identify as the thing they hate most about it. The town holds a meeting. Both men are present. The truth is fully established. Everyone in Springfield knows that their principal is a fraud, and the town then votes on whether to acknowledge this. They vote not to. Judge Snyder issues a legal decree. The imposter is now officially the real Skinner. The actual Seymour Skinner, the war hero, the prisoner of war, the man whose life was stolen, is tied to a railroad car and physically removed from Springfield. And the judge makes it explicitly illegal to ever mention the truth again, under penalty of physical punishment. A community with full knowledge of a deception voted, collectively, to sustain it. They had the truth standing in front of them, embodied by the specific human being whose life had been appropriated, and they chose the lie. Fans read this as poor storytelling, as the writers retreating from an interesting premise because they did not know how to follow through on it. As a betrayal of Skinner's character, since everything established about him, his military service, his relationship with his mother, his history with Bart, his entire personality now rests on a fiction. But what if the fans are reading the episode backwards? What if this episode is not poor storytelling about Skinner? What if it is extremely precise storytelling about Springfield? Because Springfield has always operated this way, the vote in The Principal and the Pauper is not something new. It is the explicit, public, legally formalized version of something this community does constantly, in every episode, whenever the truth is inconvenient enough to threaten the agreed-upon version of reality. Normally it happens off-screen. The dome is lifted and nobody mentions it. The comet crater is filled. The catastrophe is absorbed. The reset occurs between episodes, in the space where the show does not go, and the audience is simply presented with the default setting restored, without being shown the mechanism that restored it. The Principal and the Pauper is the one episode where the audience gets to watch the mechanism. They get to see the vote. They get to see the legal decree. They get to see the physical expulsion of the truth from the community. They get to watch Springfield do in public and in daylight what it always does in private and in darkness, decide that a comfortable lie is worth more than a damaging truth, and enforce that decision with the full weight of the community's institutional authority. The real Seymour Skinner is not an unfortunate casualty of a clumsy story. He is the last honest man in a town that has made honesty criminal. He arrived with proof that the official narrative was wrong, and the town's response was not gratitude or correction. It was elimination. Springfield has been doing this forever. It looked at the three-eyed fish and decided not to follow up. It watched a man glow green in the woods and concluded the most comforting impossible explanation rather than the straightforward alarming one. It absorbed hundreds of safety violations at a nuclear facility without demanding accountability. It forgot each catastrophe as completely as if it had never happened. It looked at a population with yellow skin and 4 fingers and 20 kinds of biological deviation from typical human anatomy and decided that was just how everyone looked. Each individual act of forgetting is small enough to attribute to other causes: the art style, episodic storytelling, cartoon logic, the floating timeline, the imperfect memory that all long-running shows develop toward their own continuity. But the vote in The Principal and the Pauper is different because it removes all those possible other explanations. There is no art style reason why Springfield would vote to sustain an imposture. There is no cartoon logic explanation for tying a war hero to a train and exiling him from his own life. This episode does not allow the audience to attribute Springfield's choice to anything other than what it is. Springfield chose the lie, not by accident, not through inertia, not through the collective unconscious drift of a community that has absorbed too much contamination to think clearly, by vote, by legal decree, by the conscious, deliberate, fully informed decision of a community that understood exactly what it was choosing and chose it anyway. Because the alternative was worse. The alternative was engaging with a truth that, once acknowledged, would not stop at Skinner, would trail backward through 20 years of everything that had been built on his borrowed identity and call all of it into question, would create a precedent for reconsidering other things, would establish, as a community norm, the idea that when evidence contradicts the official version, the evidence takes precedence. And Springfield cannot afford that precedent. A community that has agreed to look the other way about the three-eyed fish cannot allow itself to develop the habit of looking. The Principal and the Pauper is not the worst episode of The Simpsons. It is the most honest one. It is the only episode that shows you, directly and without euphemism, what Springfield is and how Springfield works. It is the show saying clearly, without the buffer of comedy, this is a community that has chosen its lies and will defend them. And if the coma theory is true, if everything since season 4 is Homer's dream, then The Principal and the Pauper acquires an additional dimension that makes it genuinely hard to sit with. Homer's dreaming brain invented a scenario where an entire community votes to sustain a false identity. A scenario where the official version of a person's life is declared more real than the person's actual life. A scenario where the lie is given legal force and the truth is expelled on a train. Why would Homer's unconscious mind construct that particular story? Because that is what Homer needs to believe about the world he has built in his dream. He needs to believe that a false version of someone can become real through collective agreement. That a borrowed life can become genuine if enough people are willing to call it genuine. That the dream, his specific dream, the one he is living inside, the one that preserves his family and his house and his life at the exact moment he loved them most, can be maintained indefinitely as long as nobody inside it decides to question it. If Springfield votes to sustain Tamzarian's false identity, then maybe the dreaming mind of an unconscious man can sustain its own version of a false existence. If the lie can be made legal, if the truth can be exiled, if the community can hold the fiction in place through consensus and decree, then maybe the dream is safe. Maybe Homer is safe inside it. Maybe the story can keep running. The Principal and the Pauper, in that reading, is not an episode about a principal with a fake name. It is Homer Simpson's unconscious mind working out the philosophical infrastructure of its own continued existence. It is the dream defending itself. And Armin Tamzarian is still in Springfield, still pretending to be Seymour Skinner, still living inside the borrowed life that a whole town agreed to protect. And the real Seymour Skinner is still out there somewhere, tied to a train that is still moving, carrying the truth about Springfield in the only direction the town ever allows truth to go. Away! Section 9. The predictions, and how a cartoon learned to read the future. There is a particular experience that happens when you are scrolling through the internet at 2 in the morning and you encounter a screenshot from a Simpsons episode that aired in 1998, sitting next to a news headline from this morning, and the two images are describing exactly the same thing. It does not matter that you have seen this happen a dozen times before. It does not matter that you have heard the rational explanations. Something in the back of your brain still registers it as impossible, as something that should not be able to happen, as evidence that the universe contains a mechanism that nobody has formally identified yet. The Simpsons predicted this. Again, the list is long enough that compiling it has become something of an internet tradition. In the year 2000, an episode depicted Donald Trump as a former president of the United States, a comic exaggeration of the absurd trajectory of American celebrity politics. Aired 16 years before the event, it appeared to describe. The smartwatch appeared in a 1995 episode, wrist-mounted and glowing, a decade before the technology existed. Commercial space tourism was satirized in a 1994 episode, with Homer reaching orbit alongside Buzz Aldrin, decades before anyone was buying tickets. An equation written on a chalkboard in a 1998 episode appeared to anticipate a specific mathematical value associated with the Higgs boson particle, which would not be experimentally confirmed until 2012. The Disney acquisition of 20th Century Fox, a media consolidation event that reshaped the entertainment industry in 2019, appeared in a 1998 episode as a satirical gag about corporate monopolization. The 1993 Springfield flu outbreak, originating from Asia, spreading to the community, triggering panic buying and a frantic search for treatment, aired 27 years before the word pandemic acquired the specific meaning it now carries for everyone alive. The Cypress Hill incident is perhaps the most precise. In 1996, the show included a joke about the hip-hop group accidentally booking the London Symphony Orchestra while in an altered state of consciousness. In 2024, 28 years later, Cypress Hill performed live with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall. The joke became a headline, and the headline matched the joke with a specificity that transcends easy coincidence. The Siegfried and Roy episode depicted a white tiger attacking one of the performers. In 2003, Roy Horn was critically injured by one of the act's white tigers. The show had not made a vague prediction about the general danger of performing with large predators. It had described a specific scenario involving a specific type of animal, and a specific kind of performer, and a specific kind of event. How is this happening? Al Jean, who has been an executive producer on the show since its earliest seasons, has given the explanation that the show's creators prefer. He said that if you throw enough darts, some of them will hit the target. The Simpsons has produced close to 800 episodes over 36 years. Each episode contains dozens of jokes and satirical observations and references to current events. When you generate that quantity of content over that length of time, some of it will coincide with subsequent real-world events through sheer statistical probability. This is not prophecy, it is volume. Bill Oakley, who ran the show during several of its most celebrated seasons, put it differently. He noted that the show is old enough that history has had time to repeat itself in various ways, and that what looks like prediction is often just the natural recurrence of patterns that were already visible when the episode was written. These are the explanations from inside the show, from the people who actually made it, from the writers who were in the room when these stories were constructed, and they are essentially correct. The rational explanation for the predictions phenomenon is a combination of volume, statistical probability, and the cyclical nature of social and political patterns. But the rational explanation does not quite account for all of it. The Trump prediction is worth examining specifically because the defenders of the volume and statistics explanation sometimes use it as their clearest example, and because examining it closely actually reveals something more interesting than either the conspiracy version or the debunking version. Trump had been publicly discussing running for president since the late 1980s. He was a public figure whose relationship with political ambition was well documented and frequently discussed by 1999. When the episode depicting his presidency was written, the writers did not look into the future and see a Trump presidency. They looked at the present and saw a specific public figure with a specific track record of self-promotion, a specific set of political ambitions that he aired regularly, and a specific cultural appetite for the merger of celebrity and institutional power, and they extrapolated that trajectory to what they correctly identified as its logical endpoint. They were not predicting, they were reading. The Simpsons writing staff has historically included graduates of Harvard, Yale, and other institutions with strong programs in mathematics, economics, political science, and the hard sciences. These are not people who are guessing. They are people who have spent years developing the ability to identify patterns in complex systems and extrapolate them forward with a high degree of accuracy. They are doing what talented analysts in any field do, seeing what is already there and describing where it is going. Most of their extrapolations turn out to be approximately correct because most social and political patterns, extended forward 5 or 10 or 20 years, arrive at approximately the place that careful observation in the present would suggest they were heading. The predictions feel magical because the window between the episode and the event is long enough to make the connection feel like foresight rather than inference. But here is where the genuinely strange part begins. Some of the predictions are too specific. The Trump escalator image, the visual of the candidate descending from above, arms out, crowd below, appeared in the 2000 episode with a specificity that goes beyond trend extrapolation. The image is not just Trump announces political ambition. It is a specific visual vocabulary that the actual 2015 announcement would replicate closely enough to produce screenshots that line up with uncanny precision. The Cypress Hill booking is not a trend. Nobody was predicting in 1996 that a hip-hop group and a symphony orchestra would eventually collaborate. This was not a pattern that careful reading of the cultural landscape would have led you to. It is a specific, improbable combination of elements that somehow found its way from a cartoon writer's room to an actual concert hall 28 years later. And this is where the meta-theory comes in, because the meta-theory is more interesting than any version of the conspiracy. The Simpsons does not predict the future. The Simpsons shapes it. Not through magic, not through any form of supernatural mechanism, through cultural influence on a scale that is genuinely difficult to fully appreciate. The Simpsons has been embedded in American popular culture for longer than most of the people currently watching it have been alive. Its jokes have entered the language. Its observations have become reference points that people use to organize their understanding of social phenomena. When the show makes a joke about corporate consolidation, millions of people see that joke. They absorb the satirical frame around the phenomenon. They encounter the real-world version of the phenomenon preloaded with that frame. When the show depicts Trump descending an escalator to announce a presidential run, that image enters the cultural bloodstream. It joins the inventory of images that people carry when they think about Trump and political ambition. It makes the actual announcement, years later, feel familiar in a way that is not quite recognition, but is close to it. The prediction did not forecast the event. The prediction made the event feel like something that had already been imagined. And when the event happens, and someone compares the screenshots, and the images are close enough to produce that specific 2 in the morning feeling, the feeling that the universe has done something it was not supposed to be able to do, what they are actually experiencing is the recognition that they were culturally prepared for this moment before it arrived. That the show gave them a framework for it, that they have seen this before, because in a very real sense, they have. Springfield does not reflect America anymore, if it ever did. America has been reflecting Springfield. The show held up a mirror to American culture for 36 years, and the audience stared into it so consistently, so devotedly, so completely across so many generations and so many cultural moments, that the thing in the mirror and the thing looking into the mirror gradually began to resemble each other. The nuclear plant, the corrupt billionaire, the incompetent safety inspector, the population too damaged and distracted to mount sustained resistance, the endless cycle of catastrophe and convenient forgetting the show put all of that into American culture's imagination, and American culture, as it tends to do with things placed powerfully enough into its imagination, began producing versions of it. The predictions are not prophecy. They are a long-running conversation between a show and its audience, and the audience absorbed the conversation into its culture, and the culture produced the reality that the conversation had been describing. There is one more dimension to the prediction phenomenon worth considering before we move on, and it is the dimension that the debunking efforts always skip past. The show has also made thousands of predictions that did not come true. Jetpacks, moon colonies, specific technological developments that the writers imagined would happen and that have not happened. Political outcomes that went entirely in the opposite direction from what the episode assumed. Cultural shifts that never materialized. Future events that the show confidently placed in its imagined tomorrow and that have never arrived. Nobody shares those. Nobody builds Reddit threads around the episode from 2003 that described a future that looks nothing like 2025. Nobody's screenshot of the Simpsons episode about the thing that never happened has gone viral on any social media platform. Confirmation bias does not just select for hits. It actively erases misses. not through any conscious process, but through the basic human tendency to share things that feel significant and discard things that do not. The prediction that came true feels significant and circulates. The prediction that failed is forgotten as quickly as Springfield forgets a dome or a comet. The result is a highlight reel that looks like prophecy, an edited version of the show's enormous output that contains only the moments where something in the writing room matched something in the world that came after, stripped of everything around those moments that would put them in proportion. But stripped of the misses, the hits become extraordinary. And there is something in the extraordinary that the rational explanation never quite quenches. Even knowing how the trick works, watching it happen is still arresting. 800 episodes, 36 years, thousands of satirical observations about the trajectory of the society that made the show, and enough of them align with subsequent reality that the show's own creators have sat in interviews and admitted, a little uncomfortably, that they sometimes wonder if they know something they should not. They probably do not. They are just very good at reading a room, and the room is America. And America, as it turns out, is a room that repeats itself. Section 10. Where is Springfield, and why won't it tell us? Springfield is the most famous fictional town in American history. More people can identify it by name, describe at least one of its residents, and place it in the cultural landscape than can identify the capital cities of numerous actual countries. It has been home to over 500 recurring characters across 36 seasons. Its specific street names, business establishments, local landmarks, and geographic features are familiar to hundreds of millions of people worldwide. It is, by any reasonable measurement, as thoroughly mapped in the public imagination as any real city. And nobody knows where it is. Not which state, not which region, not which coast, or which climate zone, or which part of what is a very large and geographically diverse country. Springfield is the best-known address in American television, and it has no actual location. And the show has maintained that absence of location with a level of consistency and apparent intention that goes far beyond ordinary production oversight. The contradictions are not occasional. They are systematic. In different episodes, Springfield is shown to be in the North, the South, the Midwest, the Northeast, and the West. It has oceanfront property and landlocked geography. It has mountains accessible for winter sports and deserts accessible for desert-related plots. It has both tropical weather systems and Arctic blizzard conditions within the span of a single season. It borders 4 different states, depending on which episode establishes the geographic context, and those 4 states include combinations that are not physically possible in actual American geography. Lisa's area code at one point appears to begin with 636, which would suggest Missouri. The state abbreviation has appeared as NT, which corresponds to no actual state. When Homer called the state capital in one episode, the person who answered described their state as beginning with a vowel, which eliminates some options while leaving more than anyone could comfortably narrow down. The show has been playing this game since its first season. Every time a clue appears that seems to point toward a specific location, the next clue appears that points somewhere else. Every time fans construct a theory specific enough to identify a region, the writers provide an episode with a detail that invalidates the theory. The precision of the contradictions suggests not carelessness but design. Springfield does not have a location because someone decided, early and consistently, that it would not have one. Matt Groening, the show's creator, provided what appeared to be the definitive answer in a 2012 interview with the Smithsonian Magazine. He said Springfield was named after Springfield, Oregon, the town near where he grew up. He said it plainly. He said it with the air of someone finally settling a question that had been following him around for 20 years. For approximately 48 hours, the mystery appeared to be solved. And then The Simpsons, either through deliberate choice or through the natural momentum of a 30-year-old production culture that had gotten very comfortable with geographic ambiguity, continued contradicting the Oregon answer. Episodes aired after Groening's interview that placed Springfield in geographic contexts inconsistent with the Pacific Northwest. The writers, if they were aware of the Smithsonian conversation, did not honor it. The mystery continued, exactly as it had before the confession. The official position, if there is one, is that Springfield could be anywhere. It is a composite. It is designed to feel familiar to every viewer, regardless of their actual geographic context, to be the town they grew up near rather than a specific town in a specific state. The universality is the point. Springfield is your town. It just happens to also be everyone else's town simultaneously. This is true. It is the genuine design philosophy, but it does not explain why the show has worked so actively to prevent location from being established, or why the geographic contradictions appear with the regularity and variety of something being maintained rather than something being ignored. The theories have answers, and they are different answers. Under the radiation theory, Springfield's geographic impossibility is simply an extension of the broader impossibility of the place. If the biology of Springfield's residents has been altered by decades of nuclear exposure to the point where they age differently and heal differently and display physical characteristics that do not appear in normal human populations, why should the geography of Springfield be bound by the normal rules? The contamination that has bent the laws of biology could have bent the laws of space as well, compressing geographic features that should be hundreds of miles apart into a single impossible region where you can drive from the ocean to the mountains to the desert in the time it takes to go from one end of a mid-sized city the other. Under the coma theory, Springfield's geography is the geography of a dream. Homer's unconscious mind does not have a precise, GPS-accurate map of the United States stored in its memory. It has impressions, it has emotional associations, it has the feeling of the ocean from a childhood trip, and the feeling of mountains from a drive-through somewhere, and the feeling of flat Midwestern land from a road trip, and the feeling of something Southwestern from something seen on television. A dream assembles place from feeling, not from coordinates. Springfield has every geographic feature Homer has ever felt strongly enough to carry in his body, all present simultaneously, arranged not by actual topographic relationship, but by the emotional logic of an unconscious mind that is building a world it can live in. Under the collective denial theory from the principal and the pauper, Springfield's geographic vagueness is functional. A town with no fixed location has no fixed jurisdiction, no consistent EPA oversight, no permanent state attorney general with a mandate to investigate its nuclear facility, no clean line of regulatory authority connecting the things that happen inside Springfield to any external body capable of holding them accountable. Springfield floats between states because landing would mean accountability. The moment Springfield is definitively in, say, Kentucky, the Kentucky authorities have a clear mandate to investigate what Burns's plant has been doing to the Kentuckians who live around it. As long as Springfield's location is genuinely uncertain, the jurisdictional question is unresolved, and unresolved jurisdictional questions are the regulatory body's most useful excuse for inaction. The show constructed a town without borders, not because borders are boring to write around, but because a town without borders cannot be inspected, cannot be held accountable, cannot be shut down by any single authority with the power to do it. Every agency that could act against Springfield runs into the same problem. We are not certain our jurisdiction applies here. Burns probably knows this. Burns has been managing the plant for long enough to understand the value of geographic ambiguity at a regulatory level, and has enough institutional knowledge of how American environmental law actually operates to appreciate the protection that comes with being nowhere specifically and everywhere in general. There is also a moment, buried in the show's own history, that suggests the location mystery is even more deliberately maintained than it appears. In the Season 12 episode Behind the Laughter, a mockumentary format in which the show plays with the idea of itself as a real family whose life has been turned into a TV program, Springfield's location is mentioned. In the original broadcast, the family is said to be from northern Kentucky. This seemed like the show, in a moment of self-referential playfulness, finally providing the answer it had been withholding for 12 years. In syndicated reruns, the location was changed. The episode now identifies a different state. The answer changed depending on which version of the episode you were watching and when you were watching it. The show gave you the truth and then revised the truth in reruns. The answer is unstable at the level of the specific episode that provided it. Even when Springfield has a location, the location is not fixed. It shifts, it mutates. It refuses to settle into the kind of certainty that would allow it to be pinned down on a map. Springfield will never be located. That is the conclusion that 36 years of evidence supports. Not because the show forgot to decide, not because the writers changed their minds too often to be consistent, but because a Springfield with a fixed location would be a different kind of place, a specific place, with specific residents, in a specific state, with specific accountability to specific regulatory bodies. A place that could, in principle, be held to account for the things that happen inside it. A Springfield with no location is a Springfield that belongs to everyone and can be regulated by no one. It is the town you grew up near. It is the community you recognize from your own experience, from wherever you are, from whatever specific version of the American nowhere you happen to have come from. It is everywhere and it is nowhere, and as long as it remains both of those things simultaneously, the cooling towers keep venting, and the fish keep growing extra eyes, and the family keeps watching television on the couch in the town that is on no map and under no authority, and that has been getting away with it, quietly and persistently and completely, for longer than most of its residents have been alive. Section 11. Hans Moleman, Ned Flanders, and the characters the show quietly broke. Not every mystery in Springfield operates at the scale of nuclear conspiracies and multi-generational family destruction. Some of them are smaller, quieter, and in their way more unsettling precisely because of how casually the show has let them accumulate. Hans Moleman is one of them. If you have watched The Simpsons with any consistency, you know Hans Moleman. He is the tiny, ancient-seeming man with the extremely thick glasses and the general demeanor of someone who has been surprised. He appears in the background of Springfield scenes. He makes occasional contributions to plots, usually in the form of suffering. He is, by any conservative count, the most frequently deceased character in the history of American animation. Moleman has been crushed by falling objects, struck by vehicles, burned, buried alive, drowned, electrocuted, eaten by animals, and subjected to varieties of physical harm that would seem excessive even in the context of a show that regularly uses cartoon physics to deliver its punchlines. He has died dozens of times. In canonical episodes, in the regular run of the show, without the dream sequence disclaimer or the treehouse of horror frame that normally signals that what is happening does not count. And then he appears in the next episode, completely fine, with no explanation and no acknowledgement that the previous episode ended with his apparent death. Most audiences have filed this away under the general category of Springfield's episodic reset. Characters die, situations resolve, the world returns to its default state. Moleman dying and returning is the same mechanism as Bart's pranks, having no permanent consequence, or Homer's catastrophes never fundamentally altering the family's living situation. Except the scale is different. The reset for the main characters involves consequences being erased, plot threads concluded without lasting effects, damage repaired without explanation, conflicts resolved and then set aside. But Moleman does not just suffer temporary consequences. Moleman dies. His body ceases to function, visibly and explicitly, and then he reappears. That is not consequence erasure. That is resurrection. And Moleman has been resurrected dozens of times, in a show that otherwise maintains, at least at the level of the regular run, if not of the Treehouse episodes, the general assumption that death is permanent. The radiation theory has the most direct explanation. If the nuclear contamination from Burns's plant has altered Springfield's biology at the cellular level, if it has produced mutations in the residents that affect everything from skin pigmentation to cognitive function to healing rate, then perhaps Moleman represents the extreme end of a particular mutation spectrum. A man whose biology has been altered so completely by decades of exposure that his cellular regeneration processes have been modified beyond the normal range. He does not merely heal from injuries. He reconstitutes from fatal trauma. Death for Moleman has been made reversible by whatever the plant has done to him. The coma theory frames Moleman differently. He is a background character, a figure that Homer's dreaming mind uses to populate the edges of scenes, to give Springfield the texture of a real community with real people living real lives in it. Background characters do not need the same consistency of continuity that main characters do. Homer's unconscious mind does not maintain Moleman's existence with the same careful attention it gives to his family. Sometimes it forgets Moleman. Sometimes it kills him off in one scene and restores him in the next, because the dream does not track minor characters with the rigor of a waking mind. Moleman dies because the dream gets tired of maintaining him. Moleman comes back because the dream needs someone in that spot. He is not a person in this reading. He is furniture that Homer occasionally breaks and then puts back. Both of these readings acquire an additional layer from a single piece of dialogue that the show delivered and then left entirely unexamined. Moleman once stated his age as 31 years old. Look at him. He appears to be in his 80s at minimum. His posture, his skin, his mobility, his overall presentation, none of it suggests a man who should be celebrating his 31st birthday. If Moleman is telling the truth, and there is no specific reason within the show to believe he is lying about this, then something aged him catastrophically. Something took a man in the early middle of his life and compressed 4 or 5 additional decades of aging into whatever time frame he has been living in Springfield. The radiation theory, again, is ready with an answer. Chronic radiation exposure can cause accelerated cellular aging. If Molman has been in proximity to the plant's runoff, and Springfield's geography suggests that essentially everyone in town is in proximity to the plant's runoff, the specific pattern of his aging might reflect an extreme form of the biological disruption that the theory argues is affecting every long-term Springfield resident. But Molman's accelerated aging is combined with his apparent physical indestructibility. He looks like a man who has aged 50 years past his actual age, and he regularly survives events that should kill him, and on the occasions when those events do kill him, he comes back. The combination of catastrophic aging and near-physical indestructibility within the same body, if the radiation theory is the mechanism, suggests that the plant's contamination produces different effects in different people, and that Molman received a particularly strange version of the mutation, rapidly deteriorated on the outside, impossibly durable on the inside. He is 31 years old and looks 80, and has died more times than any character in Springfield's history, and keeps showing up, and nobody has ever asked why. Now let's talk about Ned Flanders, because the darkness hiding beneath Ned Flanders is one of the most sustained and in some ways most devastating subtexts in the entire run of the show. On the surface, Ned is the counterpoint to Homer. Where Homer is impulsive, Ned is considered. Where Homer is negligent, Ned is responsible. Where Homer is inarticulate about his feelings, Ned expresses himself through the language of faith. Where Homer's relationship to morality is, at best, aspirational, Ned's is consistent and practiced and genuinely held. Ned is, by the metrics that most people would apply to these things, a better person than Homer in essentially every measurable way. And the show treats this by destroying everything he loves. Ned's wife Maude was killed at a NASCAR event when a t-shirt cannon misfired. The specific mechanics of the accident trace directly back to Homer's behavior. Homer was dodging t-shirts at the moment the cannon fired, and the evasion redirected the projectile trajectory toward Maude, and Maude died because Homer was being Homer in a situation where someone else paid the consequences. Homer's selfishness killed Ned's wife. Ned forgave him. This is what Ned does. He forgives, he absorbs punishment and loss and the specific, grinding unfairness of a life in which he tries to do everything right, and the universe consistently arranges to ensure that doing everything right does not protect him from anything. He responds to all of it with grace, with patience, with the language of faith that gives him a framework for understanding suffering as meaningful rather than random. But the show has shown the seams in that framework. In the episode where a hurricane destroys Ned's house and the community rebuilds it so badly that it collapses immediately, Ned snaps. He has a breakdown so complete that it results in institutionalization. He screams at the town, at his neighbors, at Homer, with the specific fury of someone who has been holding something back for much longer than they could sustain it. He says things he has been carrying for years because he has been carrying them, because the grace and patience and forgiveness have been genuine responses to genuine injury, and they have accumulated to a point where the weight of them cracked the container. And in the mental health facility, the backstory emerges. Ned was not always like this. He was not born patient. As a child, he was violent, uncontrollable, the kind of child that his beatnik parents, who did not believe in conventional discipline, were genuinely unable to manage. They took him to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist used what the show depicts as intensive behavioral modification. The University of Minnesota Spankological Protocol is the show's comedic name for it to condition the aggression out of Ned. Entirely. 8 solid months of treatment. Ned's kindness is not a character trait. It is a psychological cage. The therapy did not develop Ned's natural capacity for patience and grace. It suppressed his natural capacity for anger and aggression through conditioning so thorough and so sustained that he essentially cannot access those responses anymore, even when accessing them would be appropriate. Even when the situation calls for anger. Even when the situation calls for a man to look at the person who indirectly caused his wife's death and feel the things that a normal person would feel. The conditioning holds. And it holds at a cost. Ned's forgiveness of Homer is not generous. It is compulsive. He is physically incapable of the alternative because the alternative was trained out of him before he was old enough to understand what was happening to him. His apparent saintliness is the surface presentation of a man who was modified, without consent, to be incapable of the emotional responses that every other person in Springfield gets to have. He cannot be angry, he cannot sustain resentment, he cannot register injustice and hold it in the way that injustice typically demands to be held. He processes every blow, every loss, every unfairness through the theological framework that gives it meaning, because without that framework, what he has experienced is simply a long series of terrible things happening to someone who did not deserve them, with no compensating logic to make it bearable. And here's the detail that makes Ned's story genuinely haunting. Within the show's own internal theology, God talks to Homer, not metaphorically, not through a dream or a vision or a symbol that requires interpretation. Literally, Homer Simpson has had multiple direct, face-to-face conversations with God. God has appeared to Homer, spoken to him, engaged with his specific situation, offered specific counsel. This has happened more than once. Ned Flanders goes to church every Sunday. Ned Flanders prays. Ned Flanders has structured his entire existence around a relationship with God that he maintains through practice, through discipline, through the daily rituals of faith that he upholds more consistently than almost any other character in the show. Ned's faith is not casual or cultural. It is the organizing principle of his life. God has never spoken to Ned. God talks to the drunk who falls asleep in church and barely registers the service. God ignores the man who has dedicated himself to listening. The Simpsons is not a theological text, and reading it as a systematic statement about faith and theodicy probably goes further than the writers intended. But the pattern is there, and it is consistent, and it suggests something that the show has been saying quietly, without ever announcing it directly. Goodness is not rewarded in Springfield. Compliance is. Ned is the most compliant man in town, conditioned into compliance before he could consent to it, unable to deviate from it even when deviating from it would serve him better. And his reward for that compliance is a dead wife, a destroyed house, a neighbor who has never once reciprocated the patience and generosity extended to him, and a God who apparently finds Homer Simpson's combination of incompetence and genuine love more interesting than Ned's lifetime of careful devotion. Homer does everything wrong and cannot be held accountable. Ned does everything right and cannot catch a break. They live next door to each other. They have lived next door to each other for 36 years. And the gap between them, the gap between what their lives should look like given what they have each put into them, and what their lives actually look like has never closed. Because the system is not designed to close it. Springfield rewards the specific kind of person who keeps the wheels turning without asking too many questions. Homer keeps showing up to the plant. He keeps not inspecting things properly. He keeps providing the human infrastructure of the violation continuation mechanism that Burns depends on. The system needs Homer to remain exactly as he is. And so the system protects Homer, and Homer endures, and Homer survives everything that should have consequences. Ned's virtue, his genuine moral seriousness, his actual commitment to living in accordance with what he believes these are not useful to the system. Springfield does not need a man who does things correctly. It needs a man who does things without question. Ned asks questions. Ned has principles. Ned would notice the three-eyed fish and not accept the most convenient explanation and press for an answer. Ned is the kind of person Springfield's infrastructure is designed to neutralize, and his conditioning has done the neutralization so completely that he neutralizes himself. He is angry and he cannot access the anger. He has been wronged and he cannot sustain the grievance. He knows things are wrong and he takes them to the Lord in prayer. And the Lord in the show's internal cosmology is busy talking to Homer. Ned Flanders is what happens when you do everything right in a system that has been designed by someone who profits from things being done wrong. His kindness is real. His faith is real. His love for his children and his community is real. And none of it has been enough to protect him from a single thing that has ever happened to him. Section 12. Everything connects. The unified theory of Springfield. We have been in Springfield for a long time now, and the hour is late, and the light has changed to the particular quality that settles over everything in the quiet hours between midnight and morning. This is a good time to let everything we have covered settle, to feel the weight of it, and to ask the question that sits at the center of every theory, every mystery, every unresolved thread we have followed through 36 seasons of a show that should not still be this interesting. What is Springfield? Not in the production sense, not a long-running animated comedy produced by Fox and Gracie Films. In the sense that matters at this hour, with the voice still speaking and the theories still circling? What is this place actually? What explains it? What single thread, if you could pull it, would bring all of the contradictions and impossibilities and patterns into something that looked like coherent sense? Every theory we have discussed tonight arrives at the same junction from a different direction. That is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is genuinely unusual. Most entertainment mysteries, most cases where fans build elaborate theories around unexplained elements of a story, produce competing explanations that are mutually exclusive. The radiation theory and the coma theory cannot both be literally true. Springfield cannot be simultaneously an irradiated contamination zone and the dream of an unconscious man in a hospital bed. The specific mechanisms are incompatible. But the conclusions are not. Every theory says the same thing. Every theory, reached through a different analytical path, from a different set of evidence, through a different logical structure, arrives at the same destination. Time does not work in Springfield. Reality does not work in Springfield. Something has broken the normal operation of the world, and the specific something is connected, directly or indirectly, to the cooling towers on the horizon and the man who owns them, and the population that has spent 3.5 decades not looking at any of it too directly. The radiation theory says the contamination is physical, that it has altered the biology of the residents and the biology of the town in ways that produce every observable oddity of Springfield's existence. The coma theory says the contamination is epistemological, that the entire post-1993 show is a construction of a mind that is no longer reliably in contact with reality. The collective denial theory says the contamination is social, that the community has been modified, through generations of practice and institutional reinforcement, to actively choose comfortable falsehood over damaging truth. The Burns immortality theory says the contamination is economic, that a single person's determination to preserve his own existence has produced a closed system that cannot reform itself, because reform would threaten the person at its center. These are not competing explanations. They are the same explanation, seen from 4 different angles. Springfield is a place where something has gone wrong, and the wrongness has propagated through every dimension of its existence: biological, psychological, social, economic, temporal. The radiation bent the biology. The bent biology produced the cognitive impairment. The cognitive impairment enabled the social compliance. The social compliance protected the economic arrangement. The economic arrangement funded the continued operation of the thing that bent the biology in the first place. It is a closed system, a loop that feeds itself, a machine that has been running for so long that nobody inside it remembers a time before the machine, and nobody outside it has the jurisdiction to shut it down, and nobody connected to it has the incentive to stop it, because stopping it would mean answering for what it has done. And in the center of the loop, doing his job badly, eating his donut, falling asleep at his safety monitoring station, is Homer Simpson, the man the machine needs most. The man who was engineered for this position by the accumulated decisions of everyone around him, going back generations before he was born. The man whose mother was driven away to ensure he would grow up broken enough to be useful. The man whose cognitive function was physically compromised before he was old enough to understand what cognition was. The man whose father made a deal with the architect of all of it to ensure he would never lose the job that keeps him closest to the center. Homer is not the victim of Springfield. Homer is its most essential moving part. And he is also, this is the part that keeps you awake past the point where your body would prefer to be sleeping entirely innocent of the machinery he operates inside of. His innocence is structural. It was designed in before he could choose it. Burns needed Homer's incompetence. Burns needed Homer's specific brand of obliviousness. And Burns, or the system Burns constructed, ensured that Homer would possess those qualities by shaping the conditions of his development from the earliest possible moment. The tragedy of Homer Simpson is not that he is stupid, it is that his intelligence was taken from him before he ever got to use it. The episode where the crayon was removed and Homer's IQ normalized offers a glimpse of who Homer could have been. He was articulate and capable and aware of things that he normally filters out entirely. He was able to see Springfield clearly for the first time, and what he saw, clearly and without the protective fog of impairment, was unbearable. The clarity was too much. The full weight of what his life actually was, stripped of the comfortable numbness, was something he could not sustain. He had the crayon replaced because the alternative was a kind of consciousness that he did not have the emotional infrastructure to support. But the choice was never really free. Homer did not choose stupidity over clarity. Homer chose between two unbearable options, the one that allowed him to still feel something like happiness in his life, to still find the donuts satisfying, and the couch welcoming, and the family worth coming home to. Clarity had shown him the architecture of his cage, and he could not live inside a cage he could see clearly. So he chose the version where the cage looks like a house. That is not stupidity. That is survival. And the choice, even if we want to call it a choice, was made within a constraint structure that Burns built, and Abe accepted, and Mona's absence reinforced, and the radiation maintained. Homer's decision about the crayon happened inside a system designed specifically to make that decision feel inevitable. The Simpsons has been telling this story for 36 years. Not the story of a funny yellow family in a funny nuclear town. The story of what happens when a community surrenders its capacity for clear seeing, one small act of convenient forgetting at a time, until the forgetting becomes so total and so structural that the community is no longer capable of seeing through it, even when it wants to. Springfield has three-eyed fish and nobody asks why. Springfield has a billionaire who glows in the dark and nobody asks why. Springfield has a population with yellow skin and 4 fingers, and survival rates that defy medical explanation and nobody asks why. Springfield has a safety inspector with an IQ of 55 and nobody asks why. Springfield has children who have not aged in 36 years and nobody asks why. Springfield knows, somewhere in whatever part of a collective psyche is capable of knowing, that the questions lead somewhere they cannot afford to go. That asking why the fish have 3 eyes leads to the water, and the water leads to the plant, and the plant leads to Burns, and Burns leads to the deal, and the deal leads to Homer's mother, and Homer's mother leads to the weapons lab, and the weapons lab leads to the fact that the richest man in town was operating a facility for biological warfare in a residential community in the 1960s. And if that is where the questions lead, then the questions are the most dangerous thing in Springfield. So Springfield has decided, collectively and consistently and across 36 years of sustained episodic amnesia, not to ask. And the show has documented that decision, episode by episode, season by season, in a record so complete and so consistent that it functions as a kind of testimony. A long, slow, thoroughly demonstrated account of what it looks like when a community decides that comfort is more valuable than truth and maintains that decision long enough for it to become the only reality its members can access. The floating timeline is not a production convenience. It is the final document in that testimony. Time stopped in Springfield because the people of Springfield stopped it. They voted in whatever internal referendum a community conducts, when it decides collectively to prioritize its own stability over its own honesty, to preserve the specific configuration of their world at the moment it felt most like home, to keep their children young, to keep their houses standing, to keep the beer cold and the couch welcoming and the credits rolling every Sunday night at 8. And we, the audience, have kept that vote in place for 36 years. Every time we turned on the television and went back to Evergreen Terrace, we added our weight to the side of the scale that says the loop should keep running. We participated in the consensus. We became Springfield, in the specific way that people become the things they watch long enough and love hard enough to internalize. The greatest mystery of The Simpsons is not who shot Mr. Burns, or where Springfield is, or how Burns is still alive, or what Maggie is waiting for, or whether Homer is dreaming. The greatest mystery is why we keep going back. And the answer, if you sit with it at this hour, in this particular quality of late-night quiet, is something like, because it is the only place where the family is always intact, where the children are always young enough to still need their parents, where the house is always there, where the story never ends because nobody inside it has been willing to let it end, and nobody outside it has been willing to let them go. Homer has been in his coma, or not in his coma, in Springfield or something like Springfield, with his family or a version of his family, for 36 years. And we have been watching, and neither of us is ready for it to end. So the cooling towers keep venting, and the fish keep growing extra eyes, and Bart keeps being 10, and Lisa keeps being 8, and Maggie keeps watching from behind those enormous eyes, keeping whatever she knows to herself, waiting for the moment that is not quite here yet. And the loop keeps running. And Springfield is somewhere. Nowhere. Everywhere. Right where you left it last time you looked, exactly as you remember it, unchanged and unchanging, permanent in the specific way that only things inside a dream can be permanent. And the night is still long, and there is plenty of time to stay a little longer. Thank you for spending this time in Springfield. If you have made it to the end, you belong here. Sleep well. Total estimated word count: approximately 51,000 words. Section 3 expanded. The coma theory in depth. What the dream reveals. Let's stay in the coma for a little longer, because the theory has dimensions that the surface-level summary tends to skip past, and those dimensions are where the genuinely interesting material lies. One of the most compelling pieces of supporting evidence for the coma theory is not any single plot detail or character behavior. It is the cumulative emotional logic of what Homer's dreaming mind would want to create if it were going to create anything. Homer's relationship with failure is one of the show's most consistent and most carefully observed character notes. He fails constantly at nearly everything he attempts that requires sustained effort or planning, or the kind of follow-through that his specific combination of impulsiveness and low frustration tolerance makes almost impossible. He has held hundreds of different jobs across the show's run, in almost every sector of the economy, and he has been fired or otherwise departed from essentially all of them. He has started and abandoned businesses, projects, crusades, and hobbies in numbers that would be difficult to fully enumerate. He fails at being a good father by the metrics of attentiveness and wisdom and emotional regulation, even as he succeeds at it by the most fundamental metric, which is the one about love. And yet, in the dream, none of these failures stick. Every episode ends with Homer returned to his default position. Employed at the plant, in his house on Evergreen Terrace, in his marriage, in his family. Whatever he broke in this episode has been repaired. Whatever he lost has been returned. Whatever consequences should have followed his actions have been quietly dissolved, and Homer is exactly where he was at the beginning of the story. A dreaming mind, generating a narrative for itself in the absence of external stimulation, would naturally gravitate toward exactly this structure. The wish fulfillment logic of dreaming is well documented. You dream about what you want, and what you want tends to be modified by anxiety into scenarios where the thing you want is always slightly threatened and then always recovered. The threat is the tension that keeps the narrative interesting. The recovery is the fulfillment that keeps the dreamer engaged. The cycle repeats because the dreaming mind does not have any other gear. Homer wants his family. In the dream, he always has them. But the dream, because it is still a dream and dreams have their own internal grammar, puts them at risk in each episode and then restores them. The risk is Homer's anxiety about losing them. The restoration is what he would wish for if he were wishing. And the cycle between risk and restoration plays out over and over across hundreds of episodes, because that is what the dreaming mind does with what it loves most. Now think about the specific shape of the threats Homer's dream creates. They are almost never existential. The family is rarely in danger of actual permanent dissolution. Marge does not actually leave. Bart does not actually go to prison. Lisa does not actually lose her sense of self to the compromises the world around her pressures her to make. The threats are large enough to be scary and small enough to be survivable, which is exactly the ratio that anxiety dreams maintain. Your subconscious does not want to actually lose the thing it is afraid of losing. It wants to rehearse the losing and then recover from it, to practice the anxiety in a context where the recovery is guaranteed. That is The Simpsons. That is every episode. The family is threatened, the family recovers, the family is intact when the credits roll. Not because the writers are incapable of sustained consequence, because the dream will not allow a consequence that cannot be undone. There is another dimension to the coma theory that is rarely discussed, which involves the role of Marge within the dream. Marge Simpson, in the dream reading, is not just a character. She is Homer's anchor. She is the most consistent, most stable, most reliably present element of the dream, more so than Bart, who is occasionally absent from episodes, more so than Lisa, who exists on a separate emotional frequency from Homer, more so than Maggie, who is often in the margins. Marge is always there. She is always patient. She is always the person Homer comes home to, and she is always ultimately on his side. In the waking world, the world where Homer's body is in a hospital bed, Marge is presumably in a very different situation. She is either sitting by his bed or she has made whatever decisions a woman makes when her husband has been in a coma for months and then years and then longer. She has either waited or she has not, and either answer is a form of truth that the dreaming Homer cannot afford to know. The Marge of the dream is the Marge that Homer knew at the moment he went under. Patient, present, occasionally frustrated by him, occasionally disappointed in him, but fundamentally committed to this marriage and this family and this life they have built together. That is the Marge that the dream preserves, because that is the last version of Marge that Homer had definitive evidence of. The dream cannot update Marge any more than it can age the children. It can only work with what was there at the moment of the dream's inception. And so Marge remains patient, and she remains committed, and she is always there when Homer comes home, even after all the episodes where he has done the things he does that would, in a realistic marriage with realistic consequences, have produced outcomes far more complicated than they argued and then resolved it. The dream needs Marge to be exactly who she was. Because if Marge has changed, if Marge has moved on, found a different life, made peace with an absence that was supposed to be temporary and became permanent, then the dream is no longer a plausible version of Homer's actual life. It is just wishful thinking. And Homer's dreaming mind, it seems, cannot quite cross that line. It keeps the dream tethered to something recognizable, something grounded in who these people actually were at the moment the dream began. Which is, in its way, one of the most heartbreaking things about the coma theory. Homer is not dreaming a fantasy. He is dreaming the best approximation of reality that his damaged brain can construct, using the only reference material available to it. And the best approximation of reality that his damaged brain can construct is a world where his family is slightly imperfect and occasionally in trouble, and always, ultimately, okay. Which is all Homer has ever wanted. Which is all he has ever been trying to get to, through every disaster and every failed scheme and every moment where he fell down and got back up and tried again. He wanted his family to be okay, and in the coma, it always is. The dream gives him that over and over in hundreds of variations and will continue giving it to him for as long as the brain generating it has enough function to keep running, which, based on the current trajectory, may be for a very long time indeed. Section 4 expanded. The Burns shooting and the alternate universe. There is a thought experiment that the Who Shot Mr. Burns mystery invites, but that almost nobody runs all the way through, and it is this. What would Springfield look like in each of the alternate shooting scenarios? If Homer did it, the story of Springfield changes in a specific way. The central relationship of the show, Homer's decades-long employment under a man who cannot remember his name, who treats him with contempt, who signs his checks while systematically undermining the life of everyone Homer loves, becomes a story about a man who snapped once, who acted on a violence that his cognitive damage and emotional conditioning normally prevent him from acting on, and who then had to go back to work for the man he shot because the economic structure of his life left him no other option. That is a darker story than the show has ever told openly. It is a story about complicity, about the specific way that economic dependency can force people back into proximity with the sources of their own suffering, about the way that systems maintain themselves by ensuring that the most effective expression of rage against them remains invisible and unacknowledged and ultimately pointless. Homer shot Burns and then went back to work for him. Maybe, if the season 18 confession is anything more than a throwaway line, and if that is true, then every subsequent episode involving Homer and Burns is a story about a man standing 10 feet away from the person he once tried to kill, every day, going through the motions of normal employment because there is nothing else to do. If Marge did it, the story changes differently. Marge's character is built on the specific tension between her genuine goodness and the demands that goodness makes on her. She is patient and she is kind and she absorbs an enormous amount of difficulty without complaint. But the show has always been careful to suggest that the patience is not unlimited, that somewhere under the careful calm of her daily management of this family is a person who feels things very strongly and who has very strong views about what should and should not happen to the people she loves. Burns destroyed the things Marge cares about. Burns destroyed them deliberately and without remorse, and with the particular contempt that his class and his century of practice at ignoring consequences have given him for the people he considers beneath him. And Marge, the show suggests when you look at her carefully, is the kind of person who could respond to that with a specific, quiet, absolutely deliberate fury that neither Homer nor Bart nor anyone else who knows her would necessarily see coming. The Marge shooter theory also adds a dimension to Burns's behavior in the hospital that is not available in the Maggie theory. Burns protected Marge. He woke up from a coma with a bullet wound and identified a baby rather than the woman he had been infatuated with. That is not the behavior of a man who is simply misidentifying his attacker. That is the behavior of a man making a choice about who he is going to protect. Burns has spent a century making choices about who gets protected and who does not. He knows exactly what he is doing when he points at the sundial and lets the town draw its own conclusions. He is extending, one final time, the only kind of mercy he is capable of, not the mercy of not having done harm, but the mercy of not completing the harm he has already done. He took enough from Marge, he will not take her freedom too. If Smithers did it, the story becomes one about the specific cost of the kind of devoted service that the show has always depicted Smithers as offering. Smithers has given everything to Burns. His career, his personal life, his emotional availability, his capacity for other relationships, all of it has been redirected toward the management of Burns's existence. And Burns, on the day of the shooting, fired him, dismissed him with the casual contempt that Burns applies to everyone when they are no longer immediately useful. If Smithers pulled that trigger, he was acting not from a specific grievance about what Burns had done to Springfield. Smithers is not particularly invested in Springfield's well-being, but from the specific wound of having devoted everything to a person who discarded him without a second thought the moment the inconvenience of his principles made itself felt. That is a story about what happens when the most loyal person in a hierarchy is finally shown that the loyalty only ever flowed one direction. Each alternate ending is a different story about power and its consequences. Each one illuminates something about the specific relationship between Burns and Springfield that the official answer the baby in the parking lot deliberately obscures. And perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the official answer was chosen precisely because it does not illuminate anything. A baby in a parking lot is not a statement about power or loyalty or economic dependency or the specific costs of complicity. A baby in a parking lot is a punchline. It is the answer that closes the case without opening anything new, that satisfies the formal requirements of mystery resolution without producing any of the insights that the best mystery resolutions generate. The show chose the answer that would not make anyone think too hard about what kind of place Springfield is. The answer that would let everyone laugh and move on. The answer that Springfield, true to its nature, could absorb and forget. Section 5 expanded. What Burns remembers, and what that means. There is a quality to Burns's memory that the show has never fully examined, and it is this: he remembers everything. Burns has been alive long enough to have a personal relationship with events that everyone else knows only from textbooks and documentary footage. He has a living memory of the pre-automobile world, of American cities before the internal combustion engine reshaped them, of a social landscape that is as remote from the contemporary experience as the medieval period feels to most people today. He remembers the specific texture of those eras not as history but as experience with the clarity of someone who was present. And within Springfield, he is the only person who has that kind of temporal reach. Everyone else in Springfield lives in the floating present tense of the show's floating timeline. Their memories are reset and revised with each new backstory episode, updated to fit whatever decade the writers need them to have grown up in. Their connection to the past is as unstable as their connection to geography. Burns's connection to the past is different. It is deep, and it is specific, and it is consistent across the show's run in a way that nothing else is. Burns remembers the Gilded Age because he was there. He remembers World War II because he participated in it, in ways that the show deliberately leaves vague but that clearly involved him doing things that the concept of being on the right side of history would not comfortably accommodate. He remembers Howard Hughes because Hughes was a peer, a fellow occupant of the specific stratum of American wealth and power that operates at a level where other people's lives are resources to be managed. This gives Burns a perspective on Springfield that nobody else has. He has seen what Springfield was before the plant. He has seen what the plant did to it. He has a before and after view that spans decades, and what he sees in the after, the yellow skin, the cognitive impairment, the biological deviation from what the population looked like when he arrived, he has context for. He knows what normal looked like here. He can compare what he sees now to what he remembers seeing then. And he has chosen, consistently and across a very long period of time, to maintain the conditions that produce the difference. That choice, sustained, informed, deliberate, is the specific thing that separates what Burns has done from what might otherwise be attributed to negligence or ignorance. Negligence requires not knowing. Ignorance requires not seeing. Burns has been watching Springfield change for longer than most of his employees have been alive, and he has the temporal memory to understand what the change represents. The most chilling version of the Burns immortality theory is not the one where he survives through clever medical management. It is the one where he survives through observation, where one of the things that has kept him going, one of the things that has sustained his engagement with a world that has changed beyond recognition around him while he remained essentially the same, is the particular interest of watching what he has done to this place and its people over a very long period of time. Burns does not just own Springfield. In some very specific and very uncomfortable sense, he has been studying it. Section 6 expanded. The children of Springfield and what they see. There is a perspective on Springfield that almost nobody discusses, and it is the perspective of the children who grow up inside the loop. Not Bart and Lisa and Maggie, who have their own specific and deeply complicated relationships with the world they were born into. The children of Springfield in general. The unnamed, largely unexamined population of young people who attend Springfield Elementary, who go home to houses on streets that you can see in the background of exterior shots, who will grow up if the floating timeline allows them to grow up, which is another question entirely inside a community that has been shaped by the specific pressures we have been discussing all night. What does a child absorb growing up in Springfield? They absorb the yellow skin as normal, because everyone around them has it and it is the only skin color they have ever known in daily life. They absorb the 4 fingers as normal. They absorb the 3-eyed fish as a local curiosity, something to point at in the river and then move on from, because pointing at things and moving on is what the community around them does with anything that does not fit the agreed-upon version of reality. They grow up knowing that the largest single building in their environment is a nuclear power plant, and they do not know, cannot know, because the information is not available to them, what the specific effects of proximity to that plant might be, because the investigation that would reveal those effects has never been conducted in a way that produced results the community was required to act on. They grow up knowing that the richest man in their town has been the richest man in their town for longer than anyone can remember, which means they grow up with the intuition that wealth of that scale is simply a permanent feature of the social landscape, not something that was accumulated at cost, not something that maintains itself at cost. Burns is not a choice or a consequence to a Springfield child. He is a condition, like weather, like the shape of the hills. They grow up with Homer Simpson as their cultural model of adult working-class masculinity, not because Homer is the only model available, but because Homer is the most visible one, the one whose specific combination of qualities, the endurance, the occasional wisdom, the consistent underlying love, the spectacular and constant failure at almost everything that requires sustained application of intelligence, defines the texture of what it looks like to be a working man in this particular community. And they grow up inside the floating timeline, which means they are aging in a world where the adults around them are not. They are, within the logic of the show, the only people in Springfield who experience time normally. Everyone else is suspended. The children are moving through actual developmental stages, from infancy to childhood to adolescence, in a community whose adult population has frozen at some point in the mid-1980s and is not budging. The implications of that for the children's development are not explored by the show. The children of Springfield are mostly background figures, occasionally pulled into the foreground when a plot requires a young person. But if you imagine what it would actually feel like to be a child growing up in a community where the adults do not age, where the people who are supposed to model what growing up looks like are visibly not growing up, where the trajectory that development is supposed to follow is absent from the people you are watching for cues about where you are going, the answer is probably something that the word unsettling does not fully capture. These children are watching adults who are frozen, growing up in a world that the adults have stopped time in, moving toward a future that the floating timeline does not accommodate. Which means, if the floating timeline is real within the show's internal logic, the children of Springfield are growing toward a threshold that does not exist. They are aging toward adulthood in a world where adulthood, as a destination, has been removed from the timeline. The question of what happens when a Springfield child reaches 18, when they cross the threshold from the children who are allowed to develop toward the adults who are not, is one the show has never addressed, and that the floating timeline makes unanswerable. They are growing toward a door that does not open. Section 7 expanded. The economic architecture of Springfield. The economy of Springfield is one of the show's most consistently unrealistic elements, and it is unrealistic in a very specific way that is worth examining. Springfield's economy should not function. The town has a nuclear power plant as its primary employer and its primary source of electricity. It has a convenience store, several bars, a mall, a variety of small service businesses, and an unclear number of other employers distributed across the community in ways that the show depicts when a plot requires them and ignores when a plot does not. The scale of these secondary economic activities does not appear sufficient to support a functioning community of Springfield's size, but they are present enough to suggest that something other than the plant is providing income to people not employed there. But the central economic fact of Springfield is the plant, and the central economic fact of the plant is Burns. He controls the electricity. He employs a significant portion of the workforce. His wealth, which is of a scale that dwarfs everything else in Springfield, circulates through the local economy in ways that the show depicts as entirely mediated by his personal whims. He extends or withholds economic activity based on his own preferences, his grudges, his current schemes. The economy of Springfield is not a market economy in any meaningful sense. It is a patronage economy, organized around the will of a single powerful figure in a way that has more in common with a feudal structure than with anything that contemporary economic theory would recognize as normal. Burns is the lord. Springfield is his domain. The economic relationships between Burns and the people who depend on him, which is ultimately everyone in Springfield, whether directly or through the chain of economic dependencies that flows from the plant, are relationships of dependency and obligation that run in one direction. This matters for the radiation theory because it means that the population most affected by the plant's contamination is the population least economically capable of challenging it. The people who would most benefit from the plant being brought into compliance, who have the most to gain from the violations being addressed and the contamination being stopped, are also the people whose economic survival depends entirely on the plant remaining operational. Any action they take against Burns that threatens the plant's functioning also threatens their own incomes, their own housing, their own children's welfare. Burns has constructed his economic dominance in a way that makes organized resistance essentially self-defeating. You cannot strike against the plant without hurting yourself. You cannot demand environmental accountability without risking the closure of the facility that provides your livelihood. The choice that Burns's structure presents to Springfield's residents is not a real choice at all. It is a managed impossibility, and Burns has been managing it for long enough that most of Springfield no longer experiences it as a constraint. It is simply the shape of the world. This is also why the memory loss mechanism of the collective denial theory is so important for the economic analysis. If Springfield's residents fully retained and processed the information about what the plant was doing to their community, the contamination, the violations, the biological effects, the history of regulatory failure, the economic constraint would still be real, but at least they would know they were in it. They would be aware of the terms of the arrangement they were sustaining. They would understand, even if they could not change it, what they were trading and what they were getting in return. Springfield does not know. Springfield has forgotten, or been made to forget, or has chosen to forget, and the result is that the economic dependency is sustained not just by its structural reality, but by the community's inability to name it. You cannot negotiate terms you cannot articulate. You cannot resist an arrangement you cannot see. Burns's economic power is not maintained only by money. It is maintained by the specific combination of money and the community's inability to accurately perceive what that money is doing to them. Section 8 expanded. Lisa's impossible position. There is a character in The Simpsons whose specific situation, when examined carefully, is more difficult than anyone in the audience typically registers, and it is Lisa Simpson. Lisa is a genius. The show has established this through direct testing, through Lisa's academic performance, through her interactions with adults who recognize her intelligence even when they are threatened by it, and through the particular texture of how she moves through the world, the way she reads situations faster than the people around her, the way she arrives at conclusions before the conversation has reached the point where other characters can see them, the way she sits with the weight of knowing things that nobody else in her immediate environment wants to know. She is 8 years old. She has been 8 years old for 36 years. The specific difficulty of Lisa's position is not just that she is intelligent in a community that does not reward intelligence. That is the surface reading, and it is correct as far as it goes. But the deeper difficulty is structural and temporal, and it connects directly to the floating timeline. Lisa cannot grow up. That is, in the logic of Springfield, an immutable fact. She cannot finish her education, cannot go to college, cannot pursue the career that her intelligence and her values would push her toward in a world that allowed development to happen. She is permanently at the point in her life where she can see exactly what she wants to be and what she wants to do, and she is too young and too dependent and too constrained by her age to do any of it. Every episode gives her a glimpse of the world she wants to live in, the jazz clubs, the environmental activism, the academic communities where people argue seriously about things that matter, and then returns her to Springfield Elementary, to the same classroom, with the same inadequate instruction, to the same household where her insights are valued but not acted on, to the same town that will not change. And she knows this. She is smart enough to know that this is her situation. She is smart enough to see the loop. If the coma theory is true, Lisa's specific pain has an additional dimension. She is Homer's deepest hope for one of his children, the child who might see clearly, who might do the things that Homer could not do, who might reach the places Homer could not reach. Homer's dreaming mind has given Lisa everything he would wish for her: the intelligence, the moral clarity, the specific kind of personal courage that is required to maintain both of those things in a community that resists them. And then he has trapped her in Springfield. Because the dream cannot let her go. If she grows up and leaves, she is no longer his daughter in the house on Evergreen Terrace. She is someone else, somewhere else, living a life that Homer's coma dream cannot follow. So she stays. She remains 8 years old and brilliant and alone in a town that does not deserve her, because Homer's unconscious love cannot imagine its most cherished hope without also imagining the specific context in which that hope is daily, gently crushed. Lisa's prison is her father's love, expressed as the only thing a coma dream can express: preservation. She is preserved at the age where she still needs him, and she will remain there, unchanged, for as long as the dream keeps running. Section 9 expanded. The Simpsons movie and what the dome means. The Simpsons movie, released in 2007, is the most explicit statement the franchise has ever made about the nuclear fog theory, and the fact that it was framed as a comedy and received as one means that its central premise was absorbed and processed and then set aside without the weight it would have carried in any other context. The Environmental Protection Agency, operating in the film as a federal agency with real governmental authority, determined that Springfield was so thoroughly contaminated that the only viable course of action was physical containment. They sealed the town under a dome, a literal physical barrier between Springfield and the rest of the country, constructed to prevent the contamination from spreading outward. Think about what that means for a moment. The United States government, in the film's universe, assessed Springfield and concluded that it was a hazardous zone, not a zone that required cleanup, not a zone that required remediation. A zone that required isolation. They did not try to fix Springfield, they locked it. The dome does not appear in any subsequent episode. The film's central crisis was resolved, the dome was destroyed, and Springfield returned to its standard configuration by the time the next episode aired. The reset mechanism absorbed a moment in which the federal government of the United States formally classified an American town as too toxic to be allowed contact with the outside world, and processed it back into the show's default setting. But within the logic of the nuclear fog theory, the dome is not a plot device. It is the EPA agreeing, on the record, within the show's canonical universe, with the central claim of the theory. Springfield is a contamination zone. The federal government knows it is a contamination zone. The federal government's response to that knowledge was not to clean it up. It was to make sure the contamination did not spread further. Every person inside the dome when it went up, every Springfield resident who was sealed inside that barrier, is therefore a person who the federal government of their world has formally categorized as contained rather than helped. The people of Springfield were not identified as victims in need of remediation. They were identified as a risk to be managed. That is a specific and quite dark thing for the show's most successful theatrical release to establish as its central premise. And the fact that it was received as comedy, that the dome was processed as a plot device rather than as a statement, is itself consistent with how Springfield processes information that should be alarming. Even the audience became Springfield for those 2 hours. We laughed at the dome and moved on. Section 10 expanded. The reset button and what it costs. Every Springfield catastrophe ends the same way. The buildings are rebuilt, the relationships are repaired, the disaster is absorbed into the background and never referenced again. We have discussed this several times tonight in the context of various theories, but there is a dimension of the reset that has not been fully addressed, and it is the question of what the reset costs the people who experience it. In the real world, catastrophic events leave marks. Survivors of floods carry the flood. People who lived through fires carry the fire. Communities that experienced major traumatic events carry those events in their collective memory, in their architecture, in their emergency preparedness, in the specific things they do differently because of what happened. The marks are not always visible, but they are always present. Springfield has no marks. The town has survived events that should have left enormous marks, environmental disasters that would, in a real community, produce generational trauma, political and legal consequences that would take decades to resolve, economic disruptions that would fundamentally reshape the community's relationship to its own future. And there are no marks. Each new episode finds Springfield exactly as it was before the previous disaster, with no evidence that any of it happened and no one who behaves as if it did. The radiation theory has one explanation for this: cognitive impairment. The community literally cannot form or retain the kind of long-term episodic memories that would allow the marks to accumulate. Each disaster is forgotten because the biological mechanism for remembering it has been compromised. Springfield does not choose to move on. It is constitutionally unable to do otherwise. The collective denial theory has a different explanation. The marks are being actively suppressed. The community has a social immune system that identifies traumatic memories as threats to the agreed-upon reality and neutralizes them through the same mechanism it uses to neutralize everything else that doesn't fit. Collective forgetting, social pressure, the specific Springfield version of don't ask, don't tell. The coma theory has the simplest explanation. The marks don't accumulate because each episode is a self-contained dream cycle. The dreaming mind does not carry one dream's emotional content into the next dream. Each cycle begins fresh. The reset is not a failure of memory within the dream. It is a feature of how dreaming works. But there is a fourth explanation, one that the show has never explicitly offered, but that the texture of its storytelling suggests. What if the cost of the reset is not experienced as trauma by the people inside it, but by the audience outside it? What if the experience of watching Springfield repeatedly absorb catastrophes and return to normal, of investing emotionally in consequences that then disappear, of caring about outcomes that the show treats as provisional, what if that experience accumulates in the audience in the ways it cannot accumulate in the characters? We remember the dome. Springfield does not. We remember the monorail disaster. Springfield does not. We remember the comet, the hurricane, the shooting, the contamination, the German investors, the mother who was dead and then was not, the principal who was not himself. We carry all of it, across 36 years of watching, in the specific way that only an external observer can carry the experience of a place that refuses to remember itself. Springfield's catastrophes do not mark Springfield. They mark us. We are the archive. We are the memory that the floating timeline has denied to its residents. We remember what they cannot, and we carry what they will not. And every time we return to the show, we bring all of that weight with us, and they receive us as if we are seeing them for the first time. We are the town's relationship to its own history, distributed across an audience of millions, sustained in living human memory while the town itself floats, unchanging, in the permanent present tense of its impossible now. Section 11 expanded. Voices from outside the loop. There is a category of character in The Simpsons that rarely gets examined as a category, but that operates very consistently within the show's world. These are the characters who come from outside Springfield, who arrive already knowing things about the wider world, and who experience Springfield from the outside perspective that the residents cannot have. The federal agents who appear in various episodes. The government officials who show up with maps and legal authority. The visiting scientists, the external inspectors, the celebrities who arrive from the world beyond the cooling towers. What these characters consistently share is a quality of vision that the Springfield residents do not have. They see the town from outside. They notice things. They find the three-eyed fish alarming rather than familiar. They register the safety violations as alarming rather than routine. They experience the particular strangeness of Springfield's biological and geographic deviations because they have a comparison class. They have seen other towns, and other rivers, and other fish, and other power plants, and Springfield is different from all of those things in ways that are, to the outside eye, quite obvious. And yet these characters never successfully change anything. The federal agents who come to investigate the alien sighting in the Springfield files find that the mystery resolves into something explicable within Springfield's internal logic, and they leave without addressing any of the things that, by federal regulatory authority, they might have been empowered to address. The government officials who built the dome in the film sealed the town but did not clean it up. The external inspectors who conducted the surprise safety audit presented their findings and then disappeared from the narrative without producing any lasting change. It is as if Springfield has an immune response to outside scrutiny. External observers can see the problem. They can document it. They can even, in some cases, take formal action in response to it. But the action never leads anywhere that changes the fundamental conditions. It is absorbed by the town's specific resistance to change the way everything else is absorbed. The coma theory has an interpretation of this pattern that is particularly clean. Homer's dreaming mind includes external observers because his waking mind knew they existed. There were always regulatory bodies, always federal authorities, always people from outside Springfield whose professional function involved exactly the kind of scrutiny that the plant invited. But the dream does not allow them to actually fix anything, because fixing things would change Springfield, and a changed Springfield is not the Springfield Homer is dreaming about. The external observers are present in the dream because they were present in Homer's understanding of reality, but they cannot act effectively within the dream because the dream is not interested in the kinds of changes that effective external oversight would produce. Springfield resists outside scrutiny. The dream protects its own configuration. They are, in this reading, exactly the same mechanism, wearing different theoretical clothing. Section 12. The Unified Theory and the Long Goodbye. We have been in Springfield for a long time now, and the hour is very late, and the light has settled into the quality that belongs to the deepest part of the night, that particular darkness that is not quite silence, not quite stillness, but something between those things that the language does not have a single precise word for. This is a good moment to pull back, to look at Springfield from a sufficient distance that the whole thing comes into view at once. The plant, and the family, and the billionaire, and the fish, and the sundial, and the timeline, and the dome, and the sleeping man, in the hospital bed, and the baby with her enormous watching eyes, and ask what it all adds up to. Here is what it adds up to. Springfield is a story about the specific way that power maintains itself, not through force, though force is available and occasionally deployed, but through the management of perception, through the arrangement of conditions such that the people most damaged by those conditions are least capable of perceiving the damage accurately, through the construction of economic dependencies that make resistance self-defeating, through the cultivation of social norms that treat the acknowledgement of harm as more disruptive than the harm itself. Burns does not maintain his power by being stronger than Springfield. He maintains it by ensuring that Springfield cannot accurately perceive its own situation long enough to organize a coherent response to it. The radiation impairs the cognition. The economics make resistance dangerous. The collective denial makes the truth unsayable. And the floating timeline ensures that even if Springfield ever came close to connecting all of these things into a picture that demanded action, the reset would come along and dissolve the connection before it could harden into anything lasting. Every theory we discuss tonight is, at its core, a different description of this same dynamic. The radiation theory describes the physical mechanism by which perception is impaired. The coma theory describes a dreaming mind's inability to see its own situation clearly. The collective denial theory describes the social mechanism by which accurate perception is suppressed. The economic analysis describes the structural mechanism by which resistance is made impossible. The predictions theory describes how the show has always been, at some level, aware of the American version of this dynamic and has been trying to show it to us through Springfield for 36 years. None of these theories answers the question of what Springfield really is, because the question does not have a single answer. Springfield is all of these things simultaneously. It is a contaminated town, and a dreamer's construction, and a community that chose comfortable lies, and an economic system that produces exactly the population it needs, and a mirror that America has been staring into for so long that it has started to look familiar. And we are Springfield. That is the conclusion that every theory points toward eventually, from every angle of approach. We are Springfield. We have been watching this show for 36 years and absorbing its picture of a community that cannot see itself clearly and choosing to find it funny rather than alarming and returning to it again and again and bringing our children to it and our grandchildren and allowing its version of America, the nuclear plant and the incompetent oversight and the corrupt billionaire and the collective amnesia and the family that is always intact when the credits roll to become our reference point for what American life looks and feels like. And if Springfield is us, then the mystery of why nothing changes in Springfield is the same as the mystery of why nothing changes in the places we actually live. The same mechanisms, the same dependencies, the same social immune response to anything that would require us to look at ourselves too clearly for too long. The floating timeline is not Springfield's refusal to acknowledge time. It is ours. We stopped the clock in 1989 because we did not want to find out what would happen to the family if time kept moving. We wanted the children to stay young. We wanted the marriage to stay intact. We wanted the couch and the television and the opening credits with that specific music that tells you that you are home. And the show gave us all of that. It has been giving us all of that for 36 years. Every Sunday night at 8, and then in reruns, and then on streaming services at any hour of any day, Springfield has been there, unchanged, waiting, ready to receive us with the same family in the same house, making the same jokes about the same things in the same town that could be anywhere and therefore feels like everywhere. Homer has been asleep in his dreams since 1993, or he has been awake and working at the plant and going home to his family every evening. Either way, the story is the same. Either way, we have been watching it. And the watching has made us participants, not just observers participants. We are the thing that keeps the loop running. Our attention is the energy source that powers the mechanism. Every time we come back, every time we choose Springfield over whatever else we could be watching or doing or thinking about, we add our weight to the side of the scale that says, this should continue. This should not end. The family should remain intact. The timeline should keep floating. We are the reason nothing changes. And maybe that is okay. Maybe the choice to sit with something unchanging, to return to a place that does not age, to visit a family that is always there and always the same and always, ultimately, okay, maybe that choice is one of the most human things we do. The need for constancy in a world that never stops shifting. The desire for a home that is always exactly where you left it. The specific comfort of a story that will not end because we will not let it end, because ending it would mean admitting that the time we spent inside it is time we are not getting back, and we are not ready to do that accounting yet. So, Springfield persists. And Homer persists. And the family is always on the couch, and the credits always roll, and Bart is always 10, and Lisa is always 8, and Maggie is always there with those enormous eyes watching everything and saying nothing and waiting for the right moment. We are not ready for the loop to end. Springfield is not ready for the loop to end. And as long as neither of us is ready, it will not end. The cooling towers will keep venting into the air above a town that is on no map and under no jurisdiction, and that has been getting away with everything for 36 years. The fish will keep having 3 eyes. The billionaire will keep getting his treatments. The safety inspector will keep falling asleep at his station. And we will keep watching. Because Springfield is home. Because the family is our family. Because the couch is warm and the beer is cold and the opening music is playing. And whatever time it is where you are, whatever darkness is outside your window right now, Springfield is open. It is always open. It never closes. Good night. Section 13, The Geography of Grief. Evergreen Terrace as the show's real subject. 742. Evergreen Terrace is one of the most recognized fictional addresses in the world. More people can name it than can name the addresses of most historical monuments, most literary settings, most places that actually exist and have plaques on them, and tour guides and gift shops, and yet almost nobody treats the address as what it actually is within the emotional logic of the show. The house on Evergreen Terrace is not a setting, it is the argument. Every theory we have discussed tonight, the radiation, the coma, the denial, the immortality, the floating timeline, all of them orbit the house. Because the house is what Homer is trying to preserve. It is what the dream is trying to reconstruct. It is what the floating timeline is designed at the deepest level to protect. It is the thing that Burns's management of Springfield is designed, whether intentionally or not, to never quite reach and destroy. The specific domestic reality of a working-class family in a medium-sized American city Imperfect and funny and occasionally catastrophic, but fundamentally intact. The house has been destroyed. It has been flooded, renovated badly, invaded, burned, structurally compromised in ways that would fail any inspection, and returned to its original condition so many times that the restoration is understood to be as inevitable as the disaster that precedes it. The house endures. The family in it endures. Within the coma theory, the house is the object that the entire dream is organized around. Homer's unconscious mind is not generating Springfield in its entirety because it finds Springfield interesting as a place. It is generating Springfield as the necessary context for the house. The nuclear plant and Moe's Tavern and Springfield Elementary and the courthouse and the prison and the hospital all exist because the house requires a world around it to feel like a real house in a real town rather than a dream prop, floating in void. Burns exists because the house requires an economic structure to give Homer's employment meaning. The floating timeline exists because the house cannot be allowed to change, and if time advances, the house changes. The children grow up and leave, the furniture wears out, the neighborhood shifts, Marge changes her hair, and eventually the house on Evergreen Terrace is no longer the house that Homer remembers. The dream does not allow that. The dream preserves the house in amber, exactly as it was at the moment the dreamer last saw it, because the house is why the dream exists in the first place. Within the radiation theory, the house is the epicenter of something the theory tends to frame in terms of the community and the population. But that is always most immediately visible at the household level. Homer and Marge raised 3 children in that house while Homer was working at the plant. The children were born into whatever conditions the environment had already created in their parents, whatever the radiation had already done to the biology of 2 adults who had been living in Springfield for years before. Conception. They were brought home from the hospital to a neighborhood in the shadow of those cooling towers. They drank the water and breathed the air and played in the yard and grew up inside the contamination zone as completely as any Springfield resident could possibly be. And they are, every single one of them, remarkable. Bart is the hardest one to read through this lens, because Bart's specific kind of intelligence, quick, instinctive, socially sophisticated, oriented toward immediate situational response rather than long-term planning, is not the kind of intelligence that formal testing captures accurately, and the show tends to present him as academically struggling rather than intellectually limited. But Bart is not limited. He is, in his own idiom, extraordinarily capable. His capacity for reading social situations in real time, for identifying the exact pressure point in any given scenario, for constructing plans that are improbable on their face but somehow work, because he understands the specific human motivations driving everyone around him, that capacity exceeds most of the adults. The show puts him next to Lisa, we have already examined at length. Maggie, we have examined at length. But together, the 3 of them form a pattern that the radiation theory finds genuinely interesting. Children born to parents who had already been exposed to whatever Springfield's environment produces in long-term residence, displaying not the cognitive impairment that the theory attributes to Homer and his generation of Springfield adults, but something more varied, and in some cases, more extreme. Bart's social intelligence, Lisa's formal intelligence, Maggie's intelligence that cannot currently be measured because the instruments available are not calibrated for what she is. The mutation, if that is what it is not producing uniform results across generations. It is producing variation. The children of people who were already affected may be experiencing something distinct from what their parents experienced, a second-generation effect, an amplification or a redirection of whatever the exposure is doing to the biological systems that think and plan and remember and perceive. In an actual radiation exposure scenario, this kind of intergenerational variation is consistent with documented outcomes. The effects are not predictable at the individual level. They depend on timing, on dose, on specific biological vulnerabilities, on what stage of development a person is in during the exposure. Some people experience cognitive damage. Some people experience something else. And the children of those people may experience something else again, shaped by the specific changes their parents' biology underwent before they were conceived. The house holds all of this. The house is where the variation plays out. Homer falls asleep on the couch, and Bart is planning something clever in his room, and Lisa is reading something that nobody else in the family will understand, and Maggie is watching from her high chair with those enormous eyes. All under the same roof. All drinking the same contaminated tap water. all shaped by the same nuclear fog in their own specific ways. The house is not just a setting, the house is the laboratory. And whatever Springfield has been doing to the Simpson family for 36 years, it has been doing it most intensively in the 3 bedrooms and 1 bathroom, and combined living dining room of 742 Evergreen Terrace. Section 14. What the secondary characters know. Springfield is full of people who are not the Simpsons. They fill the town. They populate the background of every exterior shot. The bar where Homer drinks, the church where Ned prays, the school where Bart does not learn and Lisa learns everything. They have names. In many cases, the show has accumulated an extraordinary roster of named secondary characters across 36 seasons, each of them with their own implied histories, their own domestic situations, their own relationships to the central facts of life in Springfield. And almost none of them are examined closely enough to see what they know. Consider Moe Zizlak. Moe has been tending bar in Springfield for the show's entire run. He knows Homer better than almost anyone outside the family. He has been present for decades of Homer's disasters, his schemes, his occasional moments of insight, his consistent pattern of return to exactly the situation he started in. Moe has watched Homer's life run its loop, from close range, for 36 years. What does Moe think about that? The show does not ask. The show uses Moe as a supporting character, as a provider of the specific kind of resigned, self-aware cynicism that bartenders in fiction are traditionally assigned, as someone who is clearly more perceptive than his situation would suggest but who has chosen, for whatever reasons the show leaves unexplored, to remain in Springfield rather than going somewhere that his perception could be more usefully deployed. Moe knows things. You can see it in the way the show writes him when the plot requires him to be genuinely thoughtful rather than comedically miserable. He has depths. He has a history that the show has glimpsed at in specific episodes and then pulled away from. He has a relationship to Springfield that is clearly more complicated than simple inertia. But he stays. He tends bar. He answers the prank calls and pours the beers and watches Homer's loop run and does not appear to find it particularly remarkable. Which is either the most Springfield thing about him, the normalization of the impossible that characterizes every long-term Springfield resident, or it is something else. Something that looks like resignation from the outside, but might, from the inside, look like a choice that was made a long time ago and that Moe has simply stopped fighting. Chief Wiggum is another secondary character whose specific knowledge base raises questions the show does not pursue. Wiggum is in charge of Springfield's law enforcement. He is, in that role, the person most formally responsible for knowing what is happening in the town, for receiving reports, for conducting investigations, for maintaining some kind of institutional memory of Springfield's ongoing situation. He is also profoundly incompetent in ways that the show plays for consistent comedy, but that have a specific texture when examined through the lens of the theories we have been discussing. Wiggum does not solve crimes. He is distracted from investigations by trivial things. He arrests the wrong people. He loses evidence. He fails to follow obvious leads. He treats the most alarming things that happen in Springfield, the alien sightings, the environmental disasters, the shooting of the richest man in town, as problems that can be satisfactorily resolved by doing the minimum of investigative work, and then accepting whatever explanation is most convenient. Is Wiggum incompetent? Yes, demonstrably. The show has made this explicit. Is Wiggum also, in some specific cases, choosing not to know things that knowing would require him to act on? The show has suggested this too, in moments where his incompetence has the particular quality of incompetence that is strategically maintained rather than genuinely accidental. Wiggum, under Burns's control as much as any other institutional structure in Springfield, may be maintaining the specific quality of law enforcement that the town's largest employer requires. Vigorous enough to look functional? Limited enough to never seriously threaten the conditions that produce the crimes he is supposed to be preventing. Dr. Hibbert is a third secondary character whose knowledge the show uses selectively and carefully. Hibbert is the Simpson family's doctor. He has been treating Homer and Marge and the children for the show's entire run. He has access to their medical histories. He has presumably conducted physical examinations, noted biological characteristics, tracked health outcomes over time in a way that the show does not examine but that would, in a realistic medical context, have produced a significant amount of information about what living in Springfield does to a human body over decades. What does Hibbert know? He knows Homer's IQ. He knows about the crayon. He has presumably noticed the 4 fingers, the yellow skin, the specific physical characteristics that distinguish Springfield residents from the guests and outsiders who appear in the show with different proportions. He has, presumably, over the course of a long medical career in this particular town, noticed patterns in his patients' presentations that do not appear in medical literature about populations that are not adjacent to malfunctioning nuclear power plants. The show presents Hibbert as ethical, as genuinely concerned with his patients' well-being, as someone who gives information honestly, even when it is bad news. And yet the information about what Springfield's environment is doing to its residents has never, through Hibbert's practice, been synthesized into the kind of formal medical concern that would produce a public health response. Either Hibbert has not made the connection, which requires a degree of professional incuriosity that is difficult to square with his otherwise competent portrayal, or Hibbert has made the connection and has understood, in the way that all of Springfield's functional institutions seem to understand, that acting on the connection would require challenging Burns, and challenging Burns has consequences that extend well beyond any individual doctor's capacity to absorb. The secondary characters of Springfield are a network of people who each have a partial view of what is happening in their town. Each one knows something. Each one, in their own sphere, the bar, the police department, the doctor's office, the school, has access to information that, if properly aggregated and analyzed, would produce a picture of Springfield that would demand a response. They do not aggregate it. They do not share it in ways that would allow the picture to form. Each person's knowledge remains siloed, contained, applied locally, and then not followed to its implications. The bar stays the bar. The police station stays the police station. The doctor's office stays the doctor's office. And the picture that each person's partial knowledge contributes to never assembles itself into something that anyone can see whole. The radiation theory has an explanation for this. The cognitive impairment that makes connections difficult. The collective denial theory has an explanation. The social norms that make sharing certain kinds of information dangerous. The economic theory has an explanation. Each person's specific dependency on the structures that the information would threaten. All three explanations are probably true simultaneously. The secondary characters of Springfield are not conspiring to conceal the truth. They are simply, each in their own way, managing the specific limits of what they can afford to know. Section 15. The Treehouse of Horror and What the Nightmares Reveal. The Treehouse of Horror episodes occupy a unique position in the show's mythology. They are explicitly non-canonical. Events in them are not supposed to affect the main series continuity, and they are produced annually, positioned as the show's Halloween special, structured around horror and science fiction parody, and the specific pleasures of watching familiar characters encounter genre scenarios. But they have, over 36 seasons, accumulated their own body of evidence about what Springfield is and what the people in it are. The Treehouse episodes are where the show is allowed to say the things it cannot say in canonical episodes, where the radiation theory's implications can be played out to their logical ends without the constraint of returning everything to normal by the next episode, where Homer can die definitively rather than surviving another impossible injury, where Burns can be the monster he is metaphorically in the canonical episodes in a much more literal sense, where the specific horrors that the canonical show implies but does not dramatize can be dramatized fully, without consequence, in the specific safety of the non-canonical frame. And what the Treehouse episodes reveal, when you read them in the context of the theories we have been discussing, is that the writers have always known what Springfield is. The horror scenarios the Treehouse episodes choose are not random. They are not selected simply because they produce good comedy or effective genre parody. They are selected because they rhyme with something that is already true about Springfield, because they externalize and dramatize a horror that exists in the canonical series in a more muted, more deniable form. An episode where Homer is turned into a monster by experimental radiation, an episode where Burns is a literal vampire preying on the population of Springfield, an episode where the town is controlled by a malevolent alien intelligence that the residents are too manipulated to recognize as malevolent, an episode where death becomes reversible and the dead return to normal life without any acknowledgement of having been dead. Each of these Treehouse scenarios is a canonical Springfield theory, with the subtext made explicit text. Burns as vampire is Burns as he actually functions in the canonical series, extracting life from the community, sustaining himself on what he takes from them, ancient and powerful, and protected by his victims' inability to accurately name what he is doing to them. The treehouse episode makes the metaphor literal: the vampire cape, the coffin, the fangs. But the relationship being depicted is the same relationship that every Burns episode depicts, just with the language of metaphor replaced by the language of genre. Homer as radiation monster is Homer as the canonical series occasionally suggests he might be. A person whose extended proximity to the plant has produced biological changes that the show normally codes as comedy, but that could, in a different frame, read as body horror. The treehouse episode gives the transformation a plot, a climax, a resolution. The canonical series never gives it those things, but the thing being transformed is the same. The dead returning to normal life without anyone processing their return is the canonical series' reset mechanism played as horror. In canonical Springfield, continuity errors are comedy. Characters who should have lasting consequences from major events resume normal functioning without explanation. The treehouse episode treats this as something to be frightened by, the specific wrongness of death that does not stick, of consequence that does not follow from cause. The treehouse episodes are Springfield's unconscious, the things the show cannot say in the canonical frame because saying them there would require acting on them. Those things appear in the treehouse frame, acknowledged and then sealed away, every October, non-canonical, consequence-free, safe. Until you read them. Section 16. The Long Night in Springfield. A final meditation. The hour has gotten very late. Not just here, wherever you are with your eyes closing and the screen dimming and the voice coming from the speaker in the corner of the room. In Springfield, too. The town is quiet at this hour. The plant is running, the plant is always running, the plant never stops, but the town around it is as close to still as Springfield ever gets. The bars have called last orders. The church is empty. Springfield Elementary sits in the dark with its inadequate funding and its failing infrastructure, exactly as it was when the last student left. Homer is asleep. He is always asleep at this hour, on the couch or in the bed or in whatever hospital room the coma theory places him. In the deepest and most persistent sleep of all, his brain is running. His brain is always running, generating the loop, maintaining the family, keeping the dream coherent enough to continue. Marge is awake. Marge is often awake at this hour in ways the show does not examine. In the space between the end of the episode and the beginning of the next one, in the gap that the floating timeline fills with nothing. What does Marge do in the hours the show does not depict? What does she think about? In the quiet of the house after the children are asleep and Homer is on the couch, the show has always suggested an inner life for Marge that the comedy format does not have room to explore fully. A person of more complexity and more ambivalence than the patient blue-haired wife the show needs her to be for the premise to function. Lisa is awake too. Lisa is often awake at this hour, reading or practicing her saxophone quietly enough not to wake the others, or simply lying in the dark thinking about the things she thinks about, which are more serious than most adults' serious thoughts, and which she has nobody around her to share with at the level they deserve to be shared at. Lisa's nights in Springfield are long. Lisa's nights have always been long. Bart is asleep immediately, the way 10-year-olds sleep suddenly and completely, like a switch was flipped. Whatever scheme he was running today is paused. Whatever the next scheme is has not yet assembled itself in his waking mind. In sleep, Bart is just a kid, just a boy in a bed in a yellow house in a town with three-eyed fish and cracked cooling towers, and a principal who is not who he says he is. Maggie is in her crib. Maggie is always in her crib at this hour, in the official version of events. But Maggie's eyes are open. Maggie's eyes are often open in the dark, watching the ceiling, processing the day's information, running whatever calculations a mind like hers runs when the rest of the household has gone quiet and the ambient noise has dropped to almost nothing, and there is nothing to observe except the specific quality of the darkness in a room in Springfield. At the end of another episode, Ned is praying next door. Ned is always praying at this hour. The same prayers, phrased with the same careful sincerity, directed at the same God who speaks to Homer and not to Ned. What Ned asks for, in the privacy of his nightly conversation with a God who does not answer him, the show does not reveal. But the asking itself tells you something. Ned has not given up. Despite everything, the dead wife, the destroyed house, the neighbor whose selfishness permeates every corner of their shared block, the God who apparently finds Homer Simpson a more interesting conversational partner than the man who has dedicated his life to listening. Ned has not given up on the premise that the asking matters. That is either the most hopeful thing in Springfield or the saddest thing in Springfield, possibly both simultaneously. Burns is in his facility. Burns is in his treatments, or he is in whatever state the treatments leave him in at this hour, the dazed, glowing aftermath of the weekly regimen that keeps his diseased equilibrium from collapsing. His physicians are watching the monitors. Smithers has checked the schedule 3 times. The infrastructure that keeps Burns alive is functioning exactly as designed, because it is always functioning exactly as designed, because the alternative is Burns dying, and Burns dying means the loop ends. Molman is wherever Molman goes at this hour. We do not know. The show has never told us, and the theories disagree about whether Molman goes anywhere at all, in the way that conventional people go places, or whether he simply ceases and reforms at whatever location the next plot requires him to be in. If he has a home, it is not a home the show has depicted. If he has a family, they have never appeared. Molman exists in the margins of Springfield in the specific way that a man who has died several dozen times and keeps coming back exists in the margins of a place, haunting the background of other people's scenes, present when the plot needs a body to absorb something, absent when it does not. At 31 years old, in a body that looks 80, with eyes that can barely see what is in front of him, and somehow every morning he is back. Section 17. Everything the show ever wanted to tell you. The Simpsons has been on the air since the 17th of December, 1989. That sentence becomes stranger the longer you sit with it. Not just the duration 36 years, 36 seasons, approaching 800 episodes, but the specific date, December 17th, the beginning of winter. The days getting shorter, the light contracting, the world drawing inward toward the long dark of the season before the new year. The show began in the dark. It has been running ever since. And in all that time, the show has been accumulating something. Not just episodes, not just characters and callbacks and continuity errors and guest appearances and predicitons that came true and mysteries that were never resolved. The show has been accumulating a picture. A picture assembled from thousands of individual brushstrokes, each one a joke, or a plot point, or a character detail, or a background gag that most people registered and forgot, added to the canvas one episode at a time across 3.5 decades. Most of the audience has only ever seen the brushstrokes, the individual jokes, the individual episodes, the specific seasons they grew up with and the specific seasons they fell away from, and the specific scenes that circulate on social media as clips divorced from context. The individual marks. The picture they make together is the thing that the theories are trying to describe. The radiation theory is a description of the picture. The coma theory is a description of the picture. The collective denial theory is a description of the picture. The immortality theory, the predictions theory, the geographic impossibility theory, all descriptions of the same picture, approached from different angles, using different evidence, arriving at different specific conclusions but at the same fundamental observation. Something is wrong in Springfield. Something structural and sustained and deep. Something that has been there since the beginning, and that the show has been showing you since the beginning, one brushstroke at a time, in the confidence that if you watched long enough and paid close enough attention, you would eventually see it. Most people have not seen it. Most people watch the individual episodes and laugh at the individual jokes and feel the individual emotional beats and then reset, the way Springfield itself resets, and come back next time without carrying forward what the previous episode established. The audience is, in this sense, doing exactly what Springfield's residents do, processing and forgetting, enjoying and resetting, receiving the individual brushstrokes without ever stepping back far enough to see the picture. But some people step back. Some people carry one episode's evidence into the next one. Some people notice that the fish has 3 eyes and follow the question backward to the cooling towers and forward to the cognitive impairment and outward to the economic structure that maintains both. Some people notice that nobody ages and wonder what that implies about the nature of time in this particular place. Some people notice that the show has been making the same observations about power and complicity and collective amnesia for 36 years without ever resolving them, and recognize that unresolved observations of that duration are not unresolved because the writers forgot to finish them. The theories are what Springfield looks like when you see the whole picture. And the picture when you see it is this. A town has been poisoned. The poisoning has been ongoing for decades, administered by a single powerful entity that benefits from the poisoning and has structured the town's economic and social systems to prevent any coherent response to it. The poisoning has affected not just the residents' biology, but their cognition, their capacity to form the kinds of long-term memories and make the kinds of sustained connections that effective resistance requires. The town has developed, alongside the cognitive impairment, a social immune system that treats accurate perception of the town's situation as a greater threat than the situation itself, and that expels the people who insist on accurate perception rather than confronting the thing they are accurately perceiving. Inside this town, a family lives. The family is broken in specific ways that trace directly to the same powerful entity responsible for the poisoning. The father's potential was suppressed before he was old enough to develop it. His mother was driven away when he was a child. His grandfather made a deal with the entity that destroyed his family, ensuring that the son would be employed by his own oppressor for the rest of his adult life and never understand the connection. The father is damaged enough that he cannot see the architecture of what has been done to him, but not so damaged that he has stopped loving his family, and the love is real, and it is the most real thing in Springfield, and possibly the only thing in Springfield that has not been shaped or diminished or otherwise managed by the entity in the cooling tower office. The mother holds the family together through a quality of sustained attention and patience that the show presents as her most fundamental characteristic, but that is actually, when you look at what it requires, an extraordinary feat of will sustained against conditions that would have broken most people years ago. The daughter sees everything. She understands the situation with a clarity that the community around her cannot match. She speaks the truth and is ignored, or is not ignored but is heard, without being acted on, which is a specific kind of ignoring that is worse in some ways than simple dismissal, because it adds a dimension of conscious refusal. She keeps trying. She has been trying for 36 years and she has not stopped, and she will not stop, and the show has never told us whether any of it has ever worked or will ever work. But it has also never shown her giving up. The baby watches. The baby knows. The baby has not yet told us what she is going to do about it. The son is the one who keeps the whole thing from being entirely bleak, because the son's specific form of intelligence, the social, improvisational, situational intelligence that formal testing misses, is oriented toward joy, toward the specific pleasure of finding the pressure point in any situation and applying exactly the right amount of force at exactly the right moment to produce an outcome that nobody who was watching the situation from the outside would have predicted. Bart's rebellion is not effective in the way that Lisa's truth-telling is not effective. Nothing changes. The loop runs. But Bart's rebellion has a quality of pure, present-tense aliveness that Lisa's careful, principled, long-term project lacks. He is not trying to change Springfield. He is trying to be fully himself inside it, for whatever that is worth, for as long as the loop keeps running. And the father holds them all at the center of the dream, or at the center of the irradiated town, or at the center of the collective denial, depending on which theory you are applying at this particular moment. Homer loves his family. Whatever else the show tells you, whatever other implications its mysteries produce, however dark the reading gets when you follow the evidence where it leads, Homer loves his family. The love is not contingent on their behavior, or on his cognitive function, or on the quality of the day he has had at the plant. It is not a choice he makes so much as a state he is always in. The family is where Homer is pointed. The family is the thing the dream is about, if it is a dream. The family is what makes the contaminated town worth living in, if it is a contaminated town. The family is what the collective denial is ultimately in service of. If the denial exists because what else would be worth sustaining an impossible fiction for? If not the specific fiction that the people you love are okay, and the world they live in is manageable, and everything will work out because it always works out because the dream will not let it not work out. Homer loves his family. That is the show's thesis. That is what every mystery and every theory and every unexplained detail and every reset and every floating moment of the floating timeline is circling around, in the end. Not Burns's immortality, not the radiation, not the location of Springfield, or the identity of the shooter, or the secret that Maggie is keeping behind those eyes. The love. The specific, stubborn, inarticulate, enormously imperfect love of a man for his family. The dream is about the love. The town is about the love. The loop is about the love. And we have been watching it for 36 years because we recognize it. Because the love is the most familiar thing in Springfield. Because the love is the thing that does not need a theory to explain it, the thing that no mystery complicates, the thing that the radiation and the coma and the denial and the billionaire and the three-eyed fish cannot touch or diminish or explain away. Homer loves his family, and wherever you are tonight, whatever time it is, whatever the window looks like and whatever the room sounds like as the night gets deeper, you know what that is. You have seen it or felt it or been it or received it. You know what it looks like to love something so much that you would dream a whole town around it just to keep it safe. That is Springfield. That is the show. That is the thing. After all the theories and all the evidence and all the long hours we have spent in the nuclear fog of the Simpsons' impossible town that you carry with you when you finally close your eyes. Not the mystery, the love. Good night. Sleep well. Springfield will be there when you wake up. It always is. Section 18. The viewer as Springfield resident. There is a thing that happens when you watch The Simpsons for long enough. Not just a season or two. Not just the classic episodes that circulate as clips and memes and shorthand references in conversations about television history. The thing that happens when you have watched enough of the show, across enough of its run, that Springfield has become a place you know the way you know a neighborhood you grew up in, not because you lived there, but because you spent enough time there that the spatial logic is in you, that the relationship between the locations is intuitive, that you know without thinking about it that Moe's is this way, and the school is that way, and the plant is visible from almost anywhere in town if you look toward the horizon on the right side. When you have watched enough of the show that Springfield is familiar in that sense, you have done something unusual. You have absorbed, through thousands of hours of exposure, the specific texture of a place that was designed from the beginning to be impossible, but to feel possible. You have trained your sense of what a town feels like on a town that cannot exist. You have built an intuition about how communities work using Springfield as the reference architecture. And Springfield, as we have established, is a very specific kind of community. It is a community where the most powerful entity in the local landscape has spent decades ensuring that the population cannot accurately perceive their own situation, where the social norms actively suppress accurate perception, where the economic structure makes resistance self-defeating, where the accumulated history of catastrophes and cover-ups and collective forgetting has produced a population that is, in the specific way that Springfield's population is, genuinely very comfortable with not knowing things that would be uncomfortable to know. If Springfield is the reference architecture that your sense of how communities work has been built on, if Springfield is the place that feels like a place to you, after 36 years of television exposure, then the question worth sitting with is what that does to how you navigate the actual communities you live in. The show has been suggesting, since its first season, that the dynamics of Springfield are not uniquely Springfieldian, that the nuclear plant and the billionaire, and the safety violations and the collective amnesia and the economic dependency and the population that cannot quite bring itself to look directly at what is obviously wrong are all versions of things that exist in the real world, in real communities, in the actual social and economic landscapes that actual people navigate every day. Springfield is exaggerated. Springfield is cartoon. Springfield has three-eyed fish and a principal who is not who he says he is, and a baby who shot a man and a billionaire who glows in the dark. These are not literal conditions of any real place, but the relationships between them, the specific way that economic power maintains itself through the management of perception, the specific way that communities develop social norms that protect the powerful from scrutiny, the specific way that the people most damaged by a system are the people least capable of effectively challenging it. Those relationships are not cartoon. Those relationships are documentary. Springfield is a diagnosis. That is the word that appeared earlier in this script, and that keeps coming back because it is the right word. The show is not condemning Springfield. It is not presenting Springfield as a cautionary tale in the simple sense of a community that made bad choices and is now suffering the consequences. It is presenting Springfield as an extremely specific clinical picture of how a certain kind of place works, of how power organizes itself, how communities adapt to the specific pressures of that organization, how the adaptation produces the specific kind of population that can be seen in the background of every Springfield exterior shot. And the audience that has absorbed this picture, episode by episode, year by year, returning every week or every night or whenever the streaming service algorithm serves up another episode, that audience has been in a kind of extended conversation with the diagnosis for 36 years. Most of us have laughed at it. Most of us have processed the specific dynamics of Springfield as comedy and moved on. But the thing about good comedy is that it tends to leave a mark even when it is being processed as comedy. The joke makes you laugh, and then something in the back of your mind keeps turning the observation the joke was built on, because the observation was true, and true things have a way of persisting after the laughter has faded. The three-eyed fish is funny. The three-eyed fish is also, within the logic of the show's world, the most plainly visible evidence that something has gone seriously wrong in this particular environment. The joke and the horror are the same object, looked at from two different angles. You can choose which angle you look at it from. Most of the time, most of us choose the comedy angle, because the comedy angle is more comfortable and requires less from us. But Springfield has always been offering us the other angle. Quietly, consistently, without insisting, without making the discomfort mandatory. The other angle has always been there, waiting for the moment when you decide you would like to look at it. This is, in its way, the most sophisticated thing about the show. The capacity to hold the comedy and the horror in the same image simultaneously, without forcing you to choose, without demanding that you see both at once, but making both continuously available to anyone who wants to look. The three-eyed fish is funny. The three-eyed fish is evidence. It has always been both. Section 19. The weight of 36 years. There is a specific kind of tiredness that settles in at this hour of the night, not the sharp, immediate exhaustion of a long day, but something slower and more diffuse. The tiredness of someone who has been thinking for a long time about things that require sustained attention. The tiredness of following evidence to its conclusions across many hours and discovering that the conclusions are real, and that knowing they are real changes how you see certain things, and that changing how you see things, even in ways that are ultimately clarifying, requires energy. That is where we are now. We have been in Springfield for a long time tonight. We have gone to places in the show that most viewers never go, not because those places are hidden, but because getting there requires the specific combination of sustained attention and willingness to follow an argument wherever it leads that the format of television does not typically encourage. Television is designed for a different kind of attention, for the kind of watching that is comfortable and intermittent and forgiving of moments when your focus drifts. The format says, relax, let the story wash over you, do not work too hard. What we have been doing tonight is the opposite of that. What we have been doing tonight is working. Following the evidence, connecting the dots, asking the questions that the show plants and then moves away from, staying with the implications long enough to see where they lead. That work has produced something. Not answers, the show does not give answers, and we have established that this is deliberate, that the unresolved mysteries are the mechanism rather than the failure. But the work has produced a way of seeing, a way of watching Springfield that is different from the way most people watch it. A way that sees Burns not just as a villain but as a system. That sees Homer not just as a buffoon but as a person who was specifically damaged in a specific way by a specific series of events that trace back to a specific choice made by a specific powerful entity decades before Homer was old enough to understand what was happening to him. That sees Maggie not as a silent baby but as the most patient and most strategic intelligence in a town full of people who have learned, in their various ways, how to survive. That way of seeing is what the theories give you. Not the theories themselves, the theories are just the vehicle. What the theories give you is the practice of looking at a familiar thing from an unfamiliar angle and discovering that what you find there changes the familiar thing permanently. You cannot unsee it now. That is the thing about following an argument to its conclusion. Once you have seen the conclusion, it becomes part of how you see the premise. Every time you watch The Simpsons from here on, every time the opening credits roll and the family lands on the couch and an episode begins, you will have this in the background. The radiation, the coma, the deal, the weapons lab, the vote to sustain the lie, Maggie watching, Lisa trying, Homer loving, the picture behind the brushstrokes. That is what you carry with you when you finally close your eyes tonight. Not the mysteries, not the unanswered questions, not the unresolved theories or the evidence that points in multiple directions, or the specific details of any particular episode. The picture, Springfield, the whole thing seen at once, from a distance sufficient to make out the shape. And the shape, when you see it, is not as dark as the theories sometimes make it sound. The radiation and the coma and the denial and the economic manipulation are all real, within the show's internal logic, and they are all genuinely troubling when examined closely. But they are not the whole picture. The whole picture includes the house, the family, the love that the loop is organized around, the specific stubbornness of a father who will not stop trying to get home, whether he is awake or asleep. The specific stubbornness of a mother who will not stop holding the family together even when holding it together requires more patience than any realistic accounting of human patience would allow for. The specific stubbornness of a daughter who will not stop telling the truth even when nobody around her is equipped to hear it. The specific stubbornness of a baby who will not reveal what she knows until the moment is right. The Simpsons is a show about a family that will not give up. That is, underneath everything, underneath all the radiation and all the conspiracies and all the things that should have broken them and the things that did break them and the things that they chose not to see because seeing them was too much what the show is about. The family will not give up. Homer will keep trying to get home. Marge will keep the lights on. Lisa will keep asking the questions that nobody wants to answer. Bart will keep finding the exact thing to do at the exact right moment. And Maggie will keep watching. In a town that is everywhere and nowhere, in a timeline that floats above the normal flow of time, in the shadow of a cracked cooling tower, in a house on a street that appears on no map, the family will not give up. And neither, apparently, will we. Good night, sleep well, and when you open your eyes, Springfield will still be there, the way it is always there, unchanged and impossible and utterly, infuriatingly, beautifully familiar. The couch is warm. The family is intact. The loop is still running. A final note on what we leave behind. Every theory in this video has a specific kind of ending. The radiation theory ends with the cooling tower still venting. Nothing is cleaned up. The population is still inside the contamination zone. Burns is still running the plant, still managing the violations, still maintaining the economic conditions that prevent any meaningful accountability from reaching him. The theory explains everything about Springfield and changes nothing about Springfield. The town remains exactly as it was when the theory began describing it. The coma theory ends with Homer still asleep. If the dream is running, it is still running. If the episodes that have aired since April 1993 are the product of an unconscious mind generating its deepest wish, that mind has been generating it for over 30 years and shows no sign of stopping. The theory offers the most emotionally resonant explanation for why Springfield is the way it is, and leaves the dreamer exactly where he was unreachable, in his hospital bed, in his loop, with his family. The collective denial theory ends with Springfield still choosing comfort over truth. The vote has been cast. The real Seymour Skinner is still on that train. The mechanism is still running. The show is still producing resets between episodes, and the community is still absorbing them and moving forward without acknowledgement. The immortality theory ends with Burns still alive, still in his treatments, still maintaining the disease equilibrium, still powered by the same nuclear material that powers the plant that poisons the town, that funds the empire that keeps Burns alive. The closed loop, still closed. None of the theories end with a resolution. None of them produce a Springfield that is finally free of the thing that has been warping it. The radiation does not get cleaned up in any of them. Homer does not wake up. The denial does not lift. Burns does not die. And maybe that is the most honest thing about all of them. Springfield does not resolve. Springfield persists. The theories describe the mechanism of a persistence that has no visible end condition, a system that is self-sustaining in exactly the way that self-sustaining systems are, through the specific arrangement of its own components into a configuration that produces the energy required to maintain the configuration. The loop runs because the loop running produces the conditions for the loop to keep running. And we watch because watching is what we do with the things that matter to us. Even when, especially when those things are broken and complicated and full of questions that will never be answered and full of love that will never be diminished by any of that. Springfield persists. And so do we. Good night.